clarify again, in terms of a before and after state, why colonialism is such a good test for this.
Well, I think it's not that there is anything in the nature of colonialism that makes it sort of a good test. But what colonialism did was it transformed the institutions, the organization of many societies around the world, starting sometime around 1500. And these were both different outcomes within the colonial world, and because they were so deeply affecting the organization of these societies, they had very persistent effects. So in some sense, to us, colonialism is interesting in and of itself, one of the most significant things, but it was also a natural experiment that divided the world into very different institutional areas.
Well, that makes that point, I think. Before we get into our case look, we have a chance for you to win $1,000 now. Your chance to win $1,000. Just enter this nationwide
Yes, comment on point 2 that says the current economy and current trajectory of institutions in the world, if you look at the current some countries in the United States or other countries in the world.
Well, I mean, I think this is actually another topic that I'm researching, and it's fascinating but worrying. If you look at data that international organizations like the Sweden Pound, VDEM, or others collect, they see that institutions everywhere, including in the United States, including some European countries, and in many parts of the emerging world, are getting weaker and weaker. If you look at data from surveys that ask people their views about authoritarianism, dictatorship, democracy, and so on, you see that the support for democracy among the population is at an all-time low. So that suggests that despite the potential for democracy to spearhead rapid growth and consensus around difficult choices, we are not probably achieving that full potential. And in fact, my evidence also suggests that democracy, particularly under perform, when the population thinks that they under-deliver, they don't rise up to their promises in terms of providing good governance, control corruption, limiting inequality, creating poverty, and transparency and so on. So I think this is a time when democracies are going through a rough patch, and it is in some sense quite crucial that they reclaim the high ground of having government, cleaner government, and delivering sort of the promise of democracy to a broad range of people.
The presidential debate, June 27th, earlier than ever, and arguably one of the more important presidential debates we've ever had.
Questions? Again, thank you very much.
Specifically. Then, a couple weeks after that, assassination attempt. Then Joe Biden announces that he's not going to run for re-election a week later. Kamala Harris takes the Democratic nomination. No one in the party challenges her.
Hello, fellow students of Jewish history.
Tries to kill Trump on September 15th.
Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. First of all, I want to say thank you to all of you who have sent me notices saying, hey, did you see that Christopher Columbus was actually Jewish? Thank you very much. My email box is absolutely stuffed. Please stop sending the messages. I got it. I was a little bit miffed by the news because in 2017, I gave a lecture on this topic in which I said that he probably wasn't Jewish. And now I am once again proven wrong. I hope my wife does not see this video. But what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what has been discovered. And then I'd like to play you the material that I said back in 2017 that still is quite relevant, and then come back and say, well, what does this all mean for our understanding of Columbus's background, right? Okay, so here we go. First of all, the new genetic testing that has been conducted was done on remains that are believed to be those of Columbus and also those of his son. And the DNA research indicates that there are features both on the Y chromosomes and in the mitochondrial DNA, which is associated with the mother, that are consistent with patterns found in Sephardic Jews. Now, we should mention here a very important caveat that according to traditional Judaism, DNA is not in itself sufficient definition of Jewish status. Mitochondrial DNA through the mother is much more significant, but in general, DNA is not used as a definition of Jewish status. What the study actually indicates is that Christopher Columbus had DNA that was comparable to DNA that many Jewish people had, and that's something that a lot of people have, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, especially in Portugal, and actually in America. There are quite a few people who don't identify as Jewish and nevertheless have some Jewish DNA. We know that Christopher Columbus himself was especially cagey about identifying one way or another, which led to a lot of the mystery that swirled about his origins literally for centuries. So let me play for you what I had to say in 2017, which kind of runs through the evidence one way or the other, and then I'll admit the part that I no longer believe after we see this short clip.
The question, so was Christopher Columbus Jewish? The answer is, to give it away, we can all go home right now, probably not. It is highly unlikely that he was in fact Jewish. But still, we still have the question, why would one think so? Let us just quickly look at the work of Cecil Roth. We actually studied his work earlier. He wrote several books on the history of the Inquisition and the experience of Jews in late 15th century Spain. He wrote about Columbus that the mystery regarding Columbus's origins is largely the outcome of his own mendacity, meaning Columbus himself enjoyed projecting the image that he was secretly Jewish. It was kind of like a chutzpah kind. So anyways, his own mendacity, meaning he used to lie. He used to dissuade. He used to, try to put it in people's faces like, don't mess with me because I have Jewish blood. He would say, like, do you know who I am? I descend from King David. He would say things like this. He would write things like this. And he openly cultivated this kind of mystique surrounding his lineage that he hoped would add to his own grandeur. There are many characters like this you see in Jewish history. Another good example of someone who actually was ethnically Jewish would be, for example, Benjamin Disraeli, who was baptized and lived his life as a Christian, but he really enjoyed throwing it in the faces of his parliamentary interlocutors that he in fact was Jewish, and he had a unique kind of skill and a unique kind of logic that they had no access to. So he played up this quite a bit, and we shall see how it. But since Columbus frequently made these references and his background is incredibly murky, Roth concludes, as a result, it is equally impossible to exclude or to confirm the hypothesis that he was descended from a Jewish or an ex-Jewish family. In other words, probably not, but there's enough nagging doubts that at least we can talk about it for half an hour or so. Let's look at those nagging doubt issues. So here we go. But first of all, his surname, we say Columbus in English, but it would be Colon. He also signed his name as Colom, Christophe Colomb. This was a common Italian Jewish name, excuse me. So used quite often by Italian Jews. He could connect himself to many Italian Jewish families. There's quite a bit of dispute as to whether or not he came from Italy. He refers to himself as coming from Genoa or Genoa. Also, there's documents that indicate he may have come from Majorca, even documents that he may have come from Poland, which is another possibility for this Jewish origins, but none of them are really very reliable. Quite likely he may have come from Sicily. So the last name is something. The first name, definitely not. Christopher, of course, means bearer of Christ, one who carries Christ. So that's not a typical Jewish name, just like Mary. As I mentioned earlier, Columbus loved making references to his Jewish origins in person and in writing. This is kind of like a dangerous thing to do because we're living in a period when the conversos are being actively persecuted, and at the same time, he was kind of like a transitional liminal figure that was moving in and out of many royal courts from Portugal and Spain, Italy, elsewhere, trying to gain support for his venture. and whatever he thought would make himself look more exotic and more appealing in his request, he would not hesitate to use. But nevertheless, that's part of it. Third, we know he had a lot of Jewish friends. He had a tremendous amount of associations with Jews. He was very close with Abraham Zacuto in Portugal. You recall we spoke about him for an hour a few weeks ago. And he relied very heavily on Zacuto's astronomical research. The astrolabe that Zacuto had refined by making it out of metal was incredibly important to Columbus, as was the Alphonsine tables that were translated through Hebrew into Latin for him. He had many Jews on his ship. We're not precisely sure because we only have like the ship manifests. They're not complete, and they have surnames. Very many of them we simply don't know what the biographies of them are. We do know that his translator was Jewish. This is, by the way, a typical kind of Jewish profession. Jews in medicine, Jews in law, Jews in finance, and Jews in linguistics are very big. Jews, the exception of American Jewry, it's a very unusual exception, 20th century American Jewry, very monolingual. But for the most part, Jews typically are polyglots, speaking several languages and very valuable to their host societies as a result. I have a feeling that might be because Jews tend to exist on the outsides of mainstream society. In America, where we were accepted so well and so deeply, especially in the second half of the 20th century, we lost a lot of our linguistic skill because it was not necessary. But in the first half of the 20th century and earlier, perhaps in the later 21st century, we will develop that again. Hard to say. He was also very close to conversos, that is, Jews who had converted to Christianity during the course of the Inquisition. In particular, de Santagel, who was one of his main economic backers, a very important person in the royal court of Isabel and Ferdinand, who supported him and made crucial recommendations to allow the king and queen to promote his work. And a man named Sanchez as well, another major backer. And in fact, when he actually discovered the New World and he returned back and landed in the coast of Africa, he immediately sent letters describing his discovery to the king and queen. Obviously, he couldn't send letters back from the New World because postal service was not too great, connecting transcontinental messages. But he did not address those letters to the king and queen. He sent them to his Jewish buddies or his converso buddies, to Santagel and Sanchez. Very unusual that they would be the first people he writes to. There are some really tantalizing things, like, for example, he was the ships. And by the way, you should recall that he spent about a decade petitioning wealthy kingdoms to back his enterprise, pushing for his idea, bouncing from state to state. Spent a lot of time in Portugal, no luck there. Eventually ended up in Spain and got a positive yes from Isabel and Ferdinand. And the ships were completely outfitted in the first week of the month of Av. And he was ready to go on Tisha B'Av of 1492, and he delayed it one day. Even though everything was set to go, but since that is an inauspicious day in the Jewish calendar for travel, one does not embark on major journeys of any type on Tisha B'Av. For reasons that no one can really adduce, he decided to push off this highly anticipated departure for the day after. He wanted to not leave on Tisha B'Av, perhaps. Then we have lots of things that he himself said in his own writings, like his journal of his trip to America, which of course was a very celebrated work, began with the sentence, "On the day that the Jews were expelled from Spain, I set out for the New World." I mean, the very first clause of the very first sentence of his journal references the Jews and their situation in the Iberian Peninsula. A remarkable kind of way to begin this document. It doesn't begin that something like, "I knew I would find land." It begins with, "The Jews were expelled from Spain. Let's have a look at some of his personal correspondence. Here's one of the few letters that we have in his own hand that he wrote to his son Diego. There's a whole story about what happens after he discovers the New World. He ends up kind of dying in disgrace and madness and not having any credit. And so we do have a lot of material from after the discoveries as well. This is one of those letters. And you see on the top left corner, there's this funny little squiggle right where the arrow is, right where the cursor is, you see over here. That is not part of the letter text itself. It looks a little bit like he's testing out the ballpoint on his pen. But of course, this is about 400 years before they invented ballpoints. So what exactly is that? Some scholars have opined that it looks something like the traditional invocation at the beginning of a Hebrew letter. The letter is Beit Hey. I didn't have my computer easy access to handwritten letters. Like it would look a little different if you wrote them by script rather than in the Assyrian block script like this. But in fact, you can conceivably see you've got the Beit on the right and the Hey on the left in a cursive script, which is an abbreviation for the term Baruch Hashem, or blessed is the name. Which reminds me of a joke that I will try to tell you right after this. So the signing the beginning of his letters with this strange little swiggle. And by the way, he only did it in his letters to his sons. He didn't write it to other people, so just as a family thing, perhaps then as Baruch Hashem. And you may be asking, but it's on the wrong side of the page. You know, what do you want from him? He's pretending anyways. I don't know. It's true. Normally, you would write this on the right-hand side of the page, but it's not at all uncommon to see it at the center top as well. So what'd be terrible if he puts it on the left? You know, it doesn't even look very neat, but, you know, neither does his Castilian there, too. One last detail from this same letter. He developed this rather unusual signature that he was very particular about. You can just see it here. I have another copy that shows it a little bit greater contrast here. No one has yet been able to decipher this strange signature that not only did he use in the latter years of his life, but he insisted that his children also use this signature, which is a strange kind of thing to do. You know, I want you to sign my name like I sign this name, you know, not on checks or something like that. This part we can sort of figure out. The X is, of course, the Greek Chi letter, as in Christos, and this is the Greek R and the Greek O. So Christo, this is a short form for Christopher, let's say, or just for Christo at any rate. And then Ferenc is a Latinized version of the fur part in Christopher, meaning the one who bears Christ, right? Christos, Ferenc, Christopher. So that part is easy. But what's the business with this? Either the Latin letter X or the Greek letter Chi, an M and a Y, which could be an U, and the SAS with those two dots around the S's, which he insisted on being written exactly like this, in this shape, and so on. Cecil Roth, a major historian who we saw a little while ago, he argued, not specifically, not really convincingly, but nevertheless it's worth noting that this is kind of like a secret symbol to his sons that they should say Kaddish for him after he died. The conversos did definitely use a lot of secret messages that they handed down in all kinds of coded forms to their children. Do this behavior to remind you of a particular mitzvah that we have to keep and so on. So it's not at all impossible, but it's difficult to see this in his signature. Nevertheless, you take all of these things together, see that he was actually Jewish. I think it's more likely that he liked the image of being Jewish, and he actively cultivated that with his population. And that's about it.
So obviously what I have to take back from what I said 7 or 8 years ago is that whereas I believed at that point that Christopher Columbus probably was not Jewish, now I have to say that probably he was in fact Jewish. You know, and I'm just kind of bummed out by this because I wish we had this DNA evidence like a half century ago when colonialism was still favorably regarded in the Western world. Now it's just like another reason why people don't like Jews. What are you going to do? Figures. But let's just clarify what we're talking about here. What we're saying is that Christopher Columbus, he himself, we know, did not identify exclusively as a Jew. In fact, that would have been virtually suicidal. At least it would have been a career killer at the time he lived. He identified as a faithful Catholic, perhaps for pragmatic reasons. But as I said before, we watched the 2017 clip, his ancestors were quite likely Jews. Now, why did they become Catholics? Most likely they were victims of the forced conversions in the pogroms of 1391, or possibly he was descended from the many conversions that followed the disputation at Tortosa in 1414. These are people who are the so-called Marranos. That in itself is a derogatory term. A more appropriate term would be something like crypto-Jew or converso. And that population, which was quite significant in the Iberian Peninsula leading up to the year 1492, it actually constituted a very major element in the migration to the New World from the Iberian Peninsula in the 16th and 17th centuries in particular, and from Portugal especially. And that brings us back to the Caribbean, which is where we're really looking forward to visiting this January with Costa River Cruises. If you don't have a spot yet on the boat, please click on the link in the description, and we'd love to have you cruise with us. Okay, I hope you found this video useful. Thank you for watching.
Too many shout outs to all these people. He gives shout out to Aisha Speed Neon. He doesn't get enough shout outs. Everyone go follow Rabbi. This is Rabbi Rothschild and World Hunger, World Peace. This is my boy, Big Orient Cult. You are part of my cult. You are locked in, brother.
Oh, absolutely. And let me say this, even before Ari and I knew each other, he never banned
Hello,
me.
fellow students of Jewish history. I'd like to take 3 lectures to go over the entire course of the history of the land of Israel, with emphasis on the Jewish population that lived there, and with some look at the other populations with which they interacted. I'm going to break this up into 3 short videos, maybe a little bit longish videos, and they're based on a series of lectures I gave earlier this week in Vancouver that seem to have been, I think, very well received. The first lecture is going to focus on the ancient period, going all the way back from the distant beginnings of the Jewish people in Mesopotamia up to the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Then we're going to look at a kind of a stretched out medieval period starting from late antiquity with the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt right up until the 19th century. This is an extremely important period because of the entry of the Muslim people to the land of Israel, the entry of Islam to the land of Israel. And then in the last lecture, we'll look at the contemporary period, focusing specifically on the land of Israel during the period of the rise of Zionism and the state of Israel, and take it up to the current situation that we are in today. First thing I want to say is let's have a look at the geography, right? Here's Israel right in the middle of 3 major continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And just as you would imagine, Israel constitutes a sort of economic center because it is an exclusive land route between these 3 areas. It's also a major meeting place for ideas. And it's not a coincidence that it is in the land of Israel that we have the birthplace of 2 of the 3 great Abrahamic religions. That is, of course, Judaism and Christianity. And Islam is not too far away in the western part of Saudi Arabia. And of course, it comes to Israel very early on. But I think another way to look at Israel, that's one of my favorites, is the way this map maker, Heinrich Bunting, who was a very unsuccessful Protestant theologian of the 16th century, but a very gifted cartographer, represented Israel, and specifically the city of Jerusalem, as the center of a cloverleaf of Europe, Asia, and Africa. And I think this is the way a lot of Jews tend to view the world, as Israel as their center, both as the historic capital and the ancient homeland of the Jewish people, and of course it occupies a great deal of the thought of the Jewish people and their prayers for millennia, even when the majority of the Jewish population was living outside of that land. So let's focus on the early part of that history today, and the next 2 videos will go on to the medieval and modern periods. Here's another way to look at the region. This map shows you the Fertile Crescent, which unites two major economic regions of the ancient world that connect through the land of Israel, labeled here as the Levant. The two major economic regions, of course, are Egypt, which is nourished by the Nile River, a very consistent source of irrigation for the farmland that spread throughout the entire Nile, especially in the Delta region as it empties into the Mediterranean, and also in the two rivers Tigris and Euphrates. All three of these rivers, by the way, mentioned in the book of Genesis. And the two rivers in Mesopotamia, the word itself, Mesopotamia, means between the rivers, flow from the mountains in Turkey down into the Persian Gulf, and they bring with them a lot of nutrient-rich silt. So by capturing that water and irrigating the lands, you have all of a sudden, concentration of resources, and farming develops. These are two of the cradles of Western civilization. Now, when we look specifically at the origins of the Jewish people, it begins with the southern city called Genesis. But when Abraham came to what would later be called the Promised Land, or as it's called in the Bible, the land of Canaan, there were several civilizations that had already been existing there. The Natufian civilization, the Kabaran, and so on. They produced beautiful things like this delicate sculpture of a bird, or in the region of Jericho, these remarkable ritual masks whose purpose is mysterious, but nevertheless quite haunting appearances. So it's really a multi-ethnic kind of region. It's too much for us to describe in this short video, but the basic plot is that the descendants of Abraham, specifically his grandchildren's generation, moved to the land of Egypt following Joseph, and they established themselves there in the eastern part of the Nile Delta, a land called Goshen. They fall into slavery under Pharaoh, and then under this amazing leader Moses, they are rescued, redeemed from slavery, and brought back to the land of Israel in a roundabout route. They wander through the Sinai Peninsula, they receive the Torah, and then they make their way into the land of Israel sometime around the 13th century before the Common Era. Let me also mention, by the way, that I tend to be somewhat anachronistic when I use terminology. Specifically, I keep referring to the Jewish people, the origins of the Jewish people, and so on. They would not have used this word Jew for quite some time. The term the Bible uses to describe Abraham, for example, is Ivri, which is translated to English as Hebrew. The term means on the other side, probably the other side of the Euphrates River, an allusion to his origins. Abraham, the Hebrew, would mean Abraham, the one who came from the other side. Later on, his grandson Jacob would have this remarkable encounter with some sort of supernatural being, and he would receive a new name, Israel, and that becomes the name for the descendants of the Jewish people through Jacob, the Israelites, or the children of Israel. And then one of those children is Judah, for whom a section of the land would be named. And later, after the Persian domination, which we'll talk about shortly, the term Jew is applied really to all of the descendants of the children of Israel, regardless of their tribal affiliation. So I'll get back to this. Hopefully it'll be a little clearer as we go through the history. Now, I've described to you so far basically the internal Jewish history of their origins as described primarily in the book of Genesis and Exodus, a little bit into the book of Joshua. But what about when we look from the outside in? What does the rest of the world say about Jewish history? Unfortunately, we don't have much in the archaeological record about the Jewish history until about 500 years into this story. We do have, for example, some fascinating topographical information that is like place names that are derived from things like this remarkable execration figure that dates from 18th century before the Common Era Egypt. And these are basically kind of like voodoo dolls, devices that are used by the Egyptians to name all the places where people they don't like live, and then they would put those pieces through some kind of ritual of humiliation, like burning them or breaking them and so on. And so we have very early references to a lot of the places that are mentioned in the Bible, but it doesn't tell us much about the people who lived there specifically, and in particular the Jewish people. The first reference to the Jewish people, or at least a place called Israel in the historical record, is this specific stone called the Merneptah stele, also pronounced stele. It's a huge obelisk that was erected by the pharaoh Merneptah in about the year 1209 before the Common Era. It is a victory stele that essentially describes all of the various military conquests of Pharaoh. And this, by the way, this pharaoh would have been the 13th son of the pharaoh Ramses II, who many scholars opine is the unnamed pharaoh in the book of Exodus. At any rate, when you look at it closely, you see there's a long list of the many places that Pharaoh has conquered, and consistent with the description of what would be basically central Israel today, there is this reference here that says, Israel is wasted, its seed is no more. This is apparently the first in a whole series of premature predictions of the demise of the Jewish people. It's hard to know whether Israel refers to a place or a group of people, whether seed refers to its actual grain in the field, or as in the Hebrew language, and actually in the English language, the word seed can mean offspring or children. So, at any rate, Pharaoh was saying, don't worry, those nasty Israelites are gone. You don't have to worry about them anymore. You are welcome. Interestingly, Pharaoh Merneptah's mummy was also discovered, and although Israel's seed seems to be doing fairly well, thank you very much, Pharaoh himself looks not so. There are some fascinating and tempting archaeological discoveries that are very consistent with the idea of a huge population increase right about the time that the Bible describes this Exodus. There is the significant increase in construction of these homes that are called four-room houses, a specific kind of construction, and they are consistent with the idea of an influx of outsiders beyond the level of natural increase into the hill country around Jerusalem. There's nothing, however, in the construction to specifically indicate that they belong to Jewish people, although some archaeologists have zoomed in on some unusual artifacts that have suggested that maybe, in fact, Jews were here. This is actually a joke. I hope you don't mind. I'm trying to cut out the corny jokes, but some of them I simply cannot. This basically takes us through the first 500 years of Jewish history, as reported by the Jews about their own history. But if we look at it from the outside, we basically have silence in the historical record. There's a lot more to say about, how to read those early portions of the Bible, but they basically have to be read on faith, like the Bible you think would be read on faith. But I want to offer a small personal story to try and place this distinction between these early sources and historical data as we get it from the archaeological and numismatic and epigraphic literature. And I want to tell you a story about my own grandparents. This is a picture of my grandfather Alex and my grandmother Pafka shortly after their wedding in 1913. They were both Lithuanian refugees who made their way to Canada, and my grandfather set up a very small menswear store in northern Ontario. It wasn't especially successful at first. There were all kinds of things that were challenging him. He tried different businesses without too much success. He initially tried to be a farmer, and that was a disaster. But in 1916, a horrible forest fire ravaged northern Ontario. It was called the Great Matheson Fire. 200 people lost their lives in this horrific fire that spread over thousands of acres of land. So my grandfather and my grandmother, who was then expecting her second son, and she had a very young toddler child, my grandfather decided to dig a big hole in their backyard. And he took his supply of menswear and boots and undershirts and so on, wrapped them in burlap, put them in this big hole, and then buried them. And right afterwards, the three of them ran to the Abitibi River, and they waited in the river until the fire passed. Then the inhabitants of the town emerged from the river, and their homes, many of them were completely burned to the ground, and they had to start all over again. My grandfather went back and dug up the hole, found the clothing, gave it to all of his neighbors on credit. They paid him back when they could, when they found jobs and they got their life back together. And my grandparents survived, and the business survived, and in fact thrived. It would be in place in Yaqua Falls for another 100 years under my grandfather, my father, and finally my mother. Now, all of this story that I've told you, which is deeply meaningful to me, has no corroboration in the historical record. We do have a record of the Great Fire. We have photographs, we have lists of names of those who were unfortunately killed and so on. But nowhere will you find any details of any significance about my grandparents. And yet, those are the details that mean the most to me and are most essential to my personal history. From this story, I learned the values of foresight, of courage, of perseverance, of charity, all kinds of things that I grasped from this story, which I only know because my own father told me, and my own father only knows, he wasn't even born at the time, because his parents told him. This is the oral tradition. And although you could tell me, well, there's no proof for it outside, that's irrelevant to me because I trust my father, I trust my grandparents, and they're telling me something of great meaning. So I think that's one of the ways in which we can look at this earliest part of Jewish history, for which, there are no stones before the Merneptah stele of the 13th century. There's nothing to really tell us a lot about the amazing stories described in Genesis and in Exodus and the values that those stories contain. To understand the depth of them and the value of them, you shouldn't go to a history lecture. This is where you've got to go to a rabbi to find out what it really means. Let us now continue with our history, which after the Jewish people begin to be established in the land of Israel in the 13th century, then we have a lot more data that brings together both the literary sources in the later parts of the Bible and the archaeological and literary record from outside the Jewish people, which is incredibly rich and corroborative. So, as I mentioned, ironically, it's important to note that from this point onward, there is never a period of time when the land of Israel is empty of Jews. It's true that the population will shrink dramatically after several exiles under the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Romans, and so on. A tremendous amount of out-migration, but there will always be small Jewish communities that exist in the land of Israel, even if they're a tiny fragment of the population. This particular mosaic, which comes from the synagogue of Gaza from the 6th century, is a great example. You can see that it has a very beautiful sort of Byzantine style depiction of King David, written in Hebrew there, playing the harp. So what exactly happens when we pick up from where the Jews enter the land of Israel in the book of Joshua? There, they are divided into tribes and they receive territory according to their tribal affiliation. This is one of many maps that try to map out exactly where they would have been living. Note that the borders of the land of Israel are somewhat elastic throughout history. Here they extend into Lebanon, into Syria, and into Jordan as well, but they do not include Philistia or Pileshet, which is the home of the Philistines, who we'll speak about in just one moment. Initially, according to the Bible, they are ruled by a group of judges, and then later they move to a monarchy. The monarchy is extremely significant. This is an amazing depiction from the 3rd century synagogue Duro Europos, which was on the Euphrates River, and it was a rather amazing synagogue because it was buried in sand early on in its existence, and that preserved all of the amazing wall paintings. When it was finally excavated in the 20th century, they discovered these things, and oh my gosh, we learned so much about the history of time. But anyway, this is a beautiful depiction of the prophet Samuel anointing David, one of the greatest of the kings of this golden age. This is, by the way, an archaeological find from the northern part of Israel called the Tel Dan Stele that refers to the house of David. You can see in the chalked-in mark towards the bottom right there. Before I get into discussion of the kings, though, let's go back to the discussion of the other peoples living around Israel. And the most significant one, particularly on the level of nomenclature, are the Philistines. They are based primarily in 5 major cities, the Pentapolis, on the coast of the Mediterranean towards Gaza. You can see in this map here, Ekron, Gat, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza are the primary Philistine cities. The Philistines are associated with the sea peoples known as the Phoenicians elsewhere, and this term is going to be very significant. The Philistines are the historic enemy of the Jewish people as described in the Bible. There are times when they had brief alliances, but for the most part they fought. The Israelites and the Philistines had many, many small wars over time. That will become significant in a few minutes. This is a remarkable depiction by Marc Chagall of one of the battles that the Philistines had, specifically regarding the judge Samson, he of the long hair and superhuman strength, who is betrayed by his wife Delilah, and he loses his strength because they cut his hair. The Philistines take him as a captive back into their region, and he is tortured and tied to these pillars, and then with one last burst of strength and a prayer to God, he manages to push down the pillars and bring down the whole edifice on his tormentors. But I think what's especially important for us is this passage from Herodotus, a great Greek historian writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, who refers to this region and the Phoenicians living there, and he refers to it specifically by the name Palestine, or Palestine. How this enters as the principal name used in the West for the land of Israel comes from Emperor Hadrian, shown here. But, let's see, this is about 700 years later, when Hadrian is angry with the Jewish people after having fought a brutal war of some 2.5 years with the Bar Kokhba rebels. And he finally manages to extirpate the rebellion, and he crushes it brutally. He does everything he can to wipe out the memory of the Jews in the land of Israel. He bars them from Jerusalem, which he renames Aelia Capitolina after himself, Emperor Hadrian, and then he actually renames the entire territory. Rather than calling it Judea, which is the name that the Romans used for this province, he names it after the traditional enemies of the Jewish people, as you can see in this map, where it becomes Syria Palestina. Syria was actually the capital region, so it was divided into 3 areas: Syria Coela, Syria Phoenicia, and Syria Palestina. And that's where the name Palestine specifically comes from. He divides the land of Israel into 3 sections: Palestina Prima, first Palestine, which is basically Judea; Palestina Secunda, which is the Galilee region; and Palestina Tertia, which is down in the Negev. So that's basically how that word comes into usage. It's important to note that Jews use this word with some fluency right up until it becomes politically charged in the middle of the 20th century, and especially at the turn of the 21st century. In fact, there is a major document, sometimes called the Jerusalem Talmud, that was written in the land of Israel in the 4th century, and it's typically called in older scholarly literature the Palestinian Talmud, which I know sounds like a contradiction in terms, but that's only because we've developed an unusual sensitivity to the political implications of that particular place. At any rate, that's a brief discussion of the Philistine, the Philistines, their connection to a people later known as the Palestinians in the 20th century is something we'll discuss in the 3rd lecture, but that's at any rate where the name comes from. Under the 3 kings, the empire expands significantly. Solomon will take it even further out there. As you can see, it extends well into Jordan and into Lebanon as well. But it doesn't last. After King Solomon passes away, there's significant dispute between the northern section and the southern section, and they formally split, with the northern section becoming the kingdom of Israel, with its capital in Samaria, and in the south, the kingdom of Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem. There's a lot of fascinating archaeological evidence that talks about many of the events that are described in the later books of the Bible, particularly the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, including this stone, which was discovered in Jordan, called the Mesha stele. And this is essentially a Moabite, meaning non-Jewish, version of a story that's described in the book of Kings, a particular war there. And it's quite fascinating. It's long, it's a description, but at the end of one section it says, I looked down on him and his house. This is referring to Omri and his son King Ahab. And Israel has gone to ruin. Yes, it has gone to ruin forever. Once again, you see the pattern here, right? Nephthah proclaims the destruction of the Jewish people. Now, Mesha proclaims the same kind of destruction, and we shouldn't be surprised. This is another beautiful image from the local synagogue that describes various touring scenes. You can see on the right is Queen Esther seated next to King Ahasuerus, and on the left you can see Mordecai riding on a beautiful white horse, and he is being led by his enemy Haman. Not surprising, Haman is angry because look, nobody even gave him any pants. At any rate, this is a period where you begin to have a large amount of Jews living outside of the land of Israel. The first major group are the Jews from the kingdom of Israel that were displaced under the Assyrian king Sennacherib and others, who took large sections of the population and dispersed them to these areas shown here in a classical map and here in a contemporary map. The region of Lebanon, Syria, the region of northern Syria, Turkey, perhaps the Kurdish region, and further on the border of Iran and Iraq. Now, there's been a lot written about the idea of these 10 lost tribes. It's a bit of a misnomer because it wasn't a complete population movement. There were many Jews who remained behind in Israel. Many of them moved down to the south and intermingled with the population of the kingdom of Judah. And in fact, those people taken to Babylonia, although they eventually would be lost, we do have some evidence of their activity even in the late 7th century. We have, examples of their reliance on theophoric names, meaning names that include specifically Israelite names of God and so on. So they eventually disappear into the surrounding population. There is a strong kind of literary imagination that wants to think about them, somehow secreted somewhere beyond the mystical river of San Sebastian or something. One of my favorite sightings of the 10 lost tribes is in Ecuador in the 17th century, so much so that Manasseh ben Israel, a very important Dutch rabbi, used that to argue for the reintegration of Jews into England, where they had been expelled some 300 years earlier. But we don't really know what happened to those people in the long run. There is another exile that follows. As you recall, the 10 northern tribes were the ones that were taken away, and again, only a portion of the people who actually moved on, so Jews remained behind. But in the south, the kingdom of Judah remained intact for just over a century when they were then invaded by the Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar invaded. He also destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, which was the center of the Israelite religion at the time, and he exiled again a large portion of the population to Babylon. So you can see this left kind of like a scar in the Jewish historical memory. The exile from the destruction of the first temple period, and later another exile under the Romans. We'll get to that. One of the most beautiful representations of this, I think, is in literature, Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, which is depicted here in this haunting portrait by Edward Benjamin that describes how the Jews are force marched all the way to the Euphrates River, and they can see on the other side the ziggurats of Babylonia, and their tormentors demand of them that they sing a song of Zion, and they wonder, how can we sing a song of Zion in a strange land? This particular representation shows the patriarch holding a lyre with his family around him, all in tears at being exiled. However, the Jews actually set down roots in Babylonia. The prophet Jeremiah exhorted them to build houses, to plant vineyards, to harvest them. And ironically, the Jews of Babylonia would remain there right up until the 20th century, one of the longest living Jewish communities outside of the land of Israel. And even their exile was short-lived, because shortly afterwards, in the same century, the Emperor Cyrus would give leave to the exiled Jews to return to their homeland, recording his pronouncements in documents like this Cyrus Cylinder, and the Jews went back to Israel in the middle of the 6th century and ultimately rebuilt the temple again in Jerusalem, and they began to reestablish themselves, this time not as independent in their homeland, but rather as part of something like a self-governing region known as Yahud, primarily in the region of Judah. They would exist under Persian control until the 4th century, when Alexander the Great would emerge from Macedonia and sweep across the eastern Mediterranean, making his way all the way through Central Asia and to the reaches of northern India, bringing together in this area the new Hellenistic culture and uniting it under essentially Greek values. Jews in Israel loved it. They loved Greek science and literature and philosophy, and it was such a different kind of worldview than that which the Jews had been developing. And they felt so deeply in love with it that actually posed a risk to the survival of Jewish culture independently. This was exacerbated when King Antiochus Epiphanes, shown here, specifically wanted to aid those Jews who were concentrated in the cities who were very pro-Hellenistic, meaning they essentially wanted to adopt Greek norms and make Judaism into a Greek kind of image. Antiochus Epiphanes was very interested in placing idols in the temple, supporting his Hellenistic Jewish allies, and this ended up in a revolt where the rural population, much more traditional, said, this is not our way of doing Judaism. We're not into the athletic games and nude and all these statues everywhere and things like that. And this turned into something of a civil war. The pro-Hellenistic factors called in Syrian reinforcements. The reason, by the way, I'm calling it Syrian is because after Alexander the Great, who was Macedonian, passed away, the empire was divided into 3 portions, and Israel was either under the Egyptian portion or under the Syrian portion from the King Seleucus. So sometimes this is referred to as a war against the Syrians or a war against the Syrian Greeks. Among the most dramatic moments recorded in the book of Maccabees is the Battle of Beit Zechariah, in which one of the Maccabee brothers, these are like the rebel forces, leader of the rebels under Judah Maccabee, he thought that King Antiochus was riding at the top of one of their formidable war elephants, and so he dived underneath it and stabbed the animal from below, as shown in this beautiful Gustave Doré etching. The elephant died, toppling the soldiers who were on top of it. Unfortunately, he was incorrect. King Antiochus was not there in the battle, and the elephant unfortunately crushed him to death. Now, the reason why I'm focusing in on this specific battle, by the way, is because the book of Maccabees, there are actually 7 books of Maccabees, did not make it into the Hebrew scriptures. The rabbis felt, for various reasons, that they weren't really holy enough to be included in what was considered Tanakh, the Holy Scriptures, the Hebrew Scriptures, but it was picked up by other groups, including the Catholic Church, that included it in their Bible. So you have this unusual phenomenon in the Middle Ages where literate Christians tended to know more historically about the history of the Maccabean revolt than Jews did, because they were reading the books of the Maccabees. And they had illuminated manuscripts produced, and they hired artists to illustrate these dramatic moments. The only problem is that in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, most European artists had never seen an elephant or a picture of an elephant. And so you have all these hilarious representations of, well, an elephant is sort of like a big horse with a funny nose, or maybe a huge kind of dachshund, or maybe about the same size as a horse, but this is an unusually unfortunate placement of Elazar here, or some kind of like feline, African, dangerous animal. Here's my favorite, kind of like a Dr. Seuss animal with a snuffleupagus kind of thing. That's not like historically really so important, but I just thought it was kind of fun. At any rate, the Maccabees succeeded. They drove out the Syrian Greeks after a long struggle of many years, and they established what's known as the Hasmonean kingdom. Of several generations of kings, dynasties of kings that actually expanded much of the territory of Israel, and once again extending into Jordan and a little bit of Lebanon and Syria. But this Maccabean kingdom lasted only a little bit longer than a century. Ultimately, it declined with infighting, and two brothers were specifically competing for the throne, and they both independently appealed to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire says, fine, we'll help you, and General Pompey enters the land of Israel in the year 63 before the Common Era. He violates the temple, and he decides that he's not interested in supporting one side or another. He's just going to take over Judea for himself, for the Roman Empire, and he would appoint some client kings to run the state, as Rome did throughout the entire region it conquered. Among the most powerful of the Roman kings were people like Herod the Great, who was an extremely powerful builder, but at the same time a cruel tyrant. But too much detail for us now. By the time we get to the fictional year zero, there is a phenomenal amount of sectarian debate among Jews. There are Jews who are pro-Roman, those are the Sadducees, and they're specifically connected with the temple rituals. There are Jews known as Pharisees who are probably the rabbis, although there's some discussion about that specific identification. There are Jews called Zealots, who want to rebel against Rome and throw off Roman domination, like the Maccabees did earlier for the far less powerful Syrian government. And then there are Jews who are kind of like escaping it all and going living in the wilderness, like the Essenes, who may have been associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the region of the Dead Sea and the Judean desert. There are also Jewish Christians at this time, because of course Christianity is born in the first century. Initially, it's an entirely Jewish phenomenon, with all of the followers of this early movement being Jews, and having some debate over whether they're supposed to keep kosher, keep the Sabbath on Saturday, circumcision, all kinds of those things. Ultimately, however, especially under the activity of St. Paul, Christianity would expand to non-ethnically Jewish populations, and this would be an extremely potent doctrine that would be quite competitive, and ultimately, of course, by the 4th century would become the official religion of the Eastern Roman Empire. And at this point, we have 3 Roman Jewish wars. The first one is a rebellion that starts in the year 66 and is only over by 73 or possibly 74 with the fall of Masada, a mountaintop redoubt close to the Dead Sea. But these wars are absolutely disastrous for the Jewish people. The first revolt ends definitively with the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. There's a tremendous dispersal of Jews, perhaps as many as 100,000 Jews sent off by boat to serve as slaves in the Roman Empire. And then there will be another smaller revolt in the year 115 that will also be put down. And then finally the revolt in 132 under Bar Kokhba, which was perhaps the most brutal of the conflicts, with the Judean rebels relying on the network of tunnels in the desert and fighting a guerrilla war very successfully against the Roman Empire, so much so that the Emperor Hadrian, who mentioned earlier, actually had to bring a legion all the way from England to be able to put down the rebellion. But ultimately, by the time you get to the middle of the 2nd century, the Romans have definitively destroyed Jewish sovereignty in the region. Most Jews have made their way to the north, to the Galilee region, and we're going to pick up a story there in the next video. Thank you very much for watching.
Yes, I hear you, and I hear everyone out there. It's not right. We have open discrimination based on gender, and I want to stop it. I don't think it's okay to discriminate based on the color of someone's skin nor their content.
Welcome
Thank you for
to
letting me say that.
this lecture titled Sectarian Infighting and the Falls of Jerusalem. This is a lecture for Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th day of the month of Av, that we are currently in the Jewish calendar. This is the anniversary of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, both under the Romans, which we're going to be looking at in more detail today, and also, ironically, under the Babylonians. Also happens to be a day of tremendous misfortune.
That's the one.
Historically,
So,
the Warsaw ghetto went through
yeah, I have like
deportation, beginning
but
with
the booklet that I communicate with you, that's the one that we want to use. And do you mind if I just mention a few last points?
Culminate on this
Excellent.
particular
Really important things for the world are gravity batteries as opposed to lithium batteries. Gravity batteries use microgravity that essentially in your purse or your pocket will charge your phone and they never have to be charged again. I'm a big advocate for the hydrogen car. Hydrogen is the universe's most abundant element, and it's much safer than perhaps lithium-ion batteries. And so I look to hydrogen cars in the future. The one reason why we haven't had mass adoption of hydrogen cars is because it's hard to find hydrogen fueling stations. But just know that the most abundant element on Earth can be made pretty cheaply, much cheaper than electricity perhaps and petroleum. I'm a huge advocate for Wikipedia. If you can, please give to Wikipedia. Wikipedia may not always be free, and you may want to be grandfathered in. So give to it if you can. I'm a huge advocate for the Bering Strait tunnel. This is a tunnel that connects Asia and North America, and that would allow you to drive from New York to London or Cape Town. Additionally, I want to, and it's only 51 miles that need a tunnel or a bridge or something, and then also about 70 miles known as the Darien Gap between Panama and Colombia. If we're able to have a road with the Darien Gap in the Pan American Highway, you will be able to drive from Buenos Aires to London, or Buenos Aires to Cape Town, or Rio de Janeiro to wherever you want in Africa, to Cairo, to perhaps Cape Town, and hold on a second, Pretoria, or
Emil Shearer, who was a German Protestant theologian.
I appreciate that. If people know who Rob Lazar is, then a huge advocate for Rob Lazar. Absolutely. Thank you, Ari. I love you so much. I didn't even need to know that you knew who Rob Lazar was. Exactly. Shout out to Rob Lazar. Shout out to Element 115, also known as Muscovium and Unum Pensum. This is really an opportunity at anti-gravity here and ability at huge amounts of power. I think we need to study in chemistry the higher level elements. Sure, we know what hydrogen and helium are, but how about Pentium? We don't really go into it too much, but I'd like to. Okay, so I'm just going to go into Ari. I got a lot of shout outs for individuals. I'm going to run shout outs. Shout out to West Call. You have an amazing Discord. Tell your mods if we keep the cap calls. Aiden Ross, you're amazing. Your Discord division, your mods are amazing. Green, you're amazing. Illison Maki, DRB78, shout out to you. SXB, X2C, Cry, Pussy, Double XEN, you're amazing, dog. Mr. Stuyven, TC, Arnie Javi, Costume, Earae, Rothschild, Maherto, King Tenta, Odeblas, Absolute Fruiter, Hype, Angel, The Cobra, Derek, Classic Geek, Nexus, Mel Short, 271, Hour 7, Vodka Funky, RRA, Reed, Action Man, DLS, PX6, Ogasa, Cheezer, Symbol, Abu, Albier, 16, Amaranth, Theatre, YouTube, CN Smith, Ramos 53, Jeff San, Benny Naru, Gabby Dodo, Convi, Closer, Nanas TV, Los Pollos TV, Girl of Nuts. Shout out to Handmade. She does Kick News. It's amazing. Handmade. I want to see this on there. I want to see this on there. This is as big a Kick News as you're going to get. We are live streaming, fixing the platform. Watch Kick News, watch Handmade. She's amazingly talented. I can watch a 24-hour news station of just Kick News. It's amazing. And also, we've got Kick News with Burger Planet and Kick News itself and all the good people who make content on Clip, on Kick, including Kick Clip. Shout out to Kick Clip. Shout out to Vitali. Let me back in your Discord if you can. Shout out to Ice Beside. These are the
boil
biggest
down
YouTube. I got the biggest YouTubers and the biggest Twitchers, but you never know. This might allow us to go viral. I'm gonna run through. Shout out to MPL Indonesia, LCK, LOL Esports, iShow Speed. Shout out to your server, you're amazing. Your Discord server is amazing. Shout out to Lanecoin Mobile Esports, Nico Joe, LOL Pacific Championship Series, Mobile Legends, Bang Bang Indonesia, Hunt One, Pink Rock, City and Wide, Benyon, Captain India Sports Wellness, ESL Counter Strike, Oma Cola, Munda Baswari, MPL Philippines, Super Casual Channel, CBLOL, LOL, ZZZ Gaming, No Bird, Last Premier, Arena Road, Thailand, Radio Cosmos, 89.9. Shout out to DJ Mario. Shout out to all of the Japanese channels that I can't pronounce. Masia. Shout out to Johanna Tien. Shout out to R7 Tatsumaki, DNK. Shout out to Koyori. Shout out to Chuck 3 Cyril. Shout out to Capcom Fighters Japan. Shout out to Ludwig. Shout out to Zin. Typecast Gamer, Botan, Mobile Legends, Bang Bang, shout out to MPL Malaysia, PGL Dota 2, Deludo TV, Jonathan Leandy. Shout out, these are the biggest Twitchers. KO, K-Durao, this is this week, all this is hot, baby. We have right games, Apple of Play, Goodbye, Elisa 97, Echo Esports, Hassan Abbey, Case O, Gomez, OT Floyd, Zach Ward, shout out to all of you guys. Please watch my recent interview with Sam Bond and like, upload, and subscribe on YouTube. Sam Bond, thank you so much for that interview. And Ori, thank you for yours. Yes. Follow Sam Bond on Kick and Sam Bond is Sam B. Bond on Instagram, Sam Bond on Kick. If you're a fan of these streamers, please put this video and publish it everywhere you can. I'm here to make people trillionaires. For these streamers, please feature this content. Watch this content on your stream. I'm going to make all of you, your friends, your families rich. I have more data than anyone. Data is Earth's #1 resource. This is a big deal. You want to document what you did to better promote this stream. Shout out.
Maybe they need to make it up. And he decides to go to the wedding, shows at the wedding, and the host sees him there and says, "What are you doing here?" He says, "What are you talking about? I got an invitation." He says, "To the state. I want you to leave right now." And
what's going through his head right now?
Lots of plans, goals, planning for the environment. Don't embarrass me, please. Don't kick me out in front of everyone.
Like yesterday,
I said, "He says, "No, not at all."
Here we are today. Tomorrow.
Really, I don't want to be embarrassed. Allow me to pay for
Absolutely.
half the wedding.
Shout out Ori.
He says, "I don't
Eddie,
care.
shout out to
I
you.
need you
Thank you
gone."
for building such
He
a
says,
great
"I'll pay for the entire
platform.
wedding."
Santa Maria, I didn't send you that middle finger candle. I think you can see I just want to help you. I think
So
you
he ends
was a
up
really
leaving,
great
but
platform, but that was
the key point in the
someone
story, which is
impersonated me.
absolutely
Abe Ross, you're amazing. Shout out to you, by Harry Potter, Obama Son of 10
and they said,
Eddie, by Harry Potter, Obama Son of 10 Shout out to X-Straight 7. Absolutely. Shout out to Orlando Jets, X-Straight 7, XQC, Pussy. I know I named some of these people already, but I don't care. Malibu Bailey. Shout out to Lil Scam Live, Ari, you're amazing. I love you so much. Shout out to iShow Speed. Shout out to Mr. Beast. I'm going to overtake you, and that's going to be a great day. Shout out to T-Series. I'm going to
T-Series.
No,
I'm pretty sure you hit like Subaru with like Nissan in there, man. You got every shout out in the entire world. Rabbi, so
the rabbis went confronted this. I won't go into technical details, but they failed to find an adequate response to it. And there's one particular individual, Rabbi Rothschild, decided that the rabbis had to be really tied into his specific vision of how the law should be expressed, and rather than make an adaptation because of the unique moment, this ultimately brought about the destruction of the temple by angling them. The historicity of all these events is really based totally in the
excellent. Shout out to Beyonce. I love your name. I remember the Caspian Sea, Elisa Jordana. Shout out to Davio Exinisi.
Our major source for today, of course, is going to be none other than
Messi on the wall.
known in his day as
Just one
Joseph
moment. Let's see
ben
if we can get this going. Just real quick.
actually a rather brilliant historian. He's a complicated figure.
You do you, baby. Shout out to Augustina. Shout out to Razo 97.
Jewish War relates. He was a Pharisee who had a huge experiment with a lot of different religious organizations within Judaism. As we
Shout out to
see
Nick White. Shout out to everybody who speaks Spanish. Shout out to Sweater GXP, Sweater Beard, Moises, Zena the Witch, shout out to SJC, Guy shout out to Faze, Osmond, Mike, Baby, shout out to Action Man. I was just in your Discord, and I just entered it, and I got thrown out within 3 seconds. Please let me back in. If you're wondering how can documenting your life be positive, it provides a treasure trove of data that can be valuable to researchers and businesses by tracking everything you do. It's possible to be able to monetize the data. Shout out to everyone else out there, and I want everyone to know, hey, Carter, I love you very much. We're going to take this coin to the moon, and you should also know that I'm in a fantasy football league, and I'm going to now shout out Keith, Liam, what you say, bro, $1 Mongo, no All's Glory, the tickets, the Spastic Specialist, Team Hurricane Nate, Sparta 69ers, Black Cats, Bitcoin 2, $69.42, can't catch them.
First and foremost, because after all,
he
was
tell
a
him
rebel
some of the
who then
things that
ended
we
up
talked about in the
joining
future. Shout out to the Del Ringo Star Beyonce, Paul McCartney,
and
Taylor
what
Swift,
does that say about his motivation? He was right
Eilish, Lady
under
Gaga, Bruno Mars, Kendrick Lamar,
official
Rolling Stones,
sponsorship,
all
so
of you too.
it would
Jay-Z,
be rare
Rihanna,
that not be
Coldplay, Imagine
skewed
Dragons,
towards his
Dua Lipa, The
sponsors.
Weeknd, Lizzo,
We know
Travis
that he
Scott,
wrote an
Billy Joe,
earlier
Ariana
version
Grande,
of
Fleetwood Mac,
this
Red Hot Chili
history,
Peppers, I'm
which
almost
he
done,
wrote
baby.
in
Cool Vibes,
Aramaic,
Maroon 5,
but that
Hozier,
version
Camila
unfortunately
Cabello,
was
John
lost to
Garcia,
history, and so we
Post
only have the
Malone, Nicki
version that he
Minaj,
wrote in
Shakira,
Greek,
Florence and the
which
Machine,
was the
Mumford
lingua
Sons,
franca
Paramore,
of the
Jason
Eastern
Derulo,
Mediterranean.
21 Pilots, Panic at the Disco, Katy Perry, Pearl Jam, Black Kings, Metallica, Kings of Leon, The Killers, Beck, Jesse Ward, Nora Jones, Lenny Kravitz, Tame Impala, Usher, Bryce Vine, Wiz Khalifa, Eminem. And when we talk in the future, some of the topics we can talk about are future clocks, atomic clock, nuclear clocks, optical clocks, astronomical clocks, and then also just to give some people an idea. When Rabbi and Lori talk next time, what are some topics? An acne-mat vaccine, a vaccine and preventing acne by targeting the bacteria and inflammatory processes, and perhaps an anti-prion drug, a medication aimed at preventing treating prion diseases, artificial gills, a device that allows you to heal.
Right in on team specific. I want to bring that up.
Cassius Dio, also
Everyone,
very important
next time we
historian,
talk,
and
me and Rabbi,
Eusebius, some
we're
very
going to go in
church
detail about
historians.
specific topics.
And you can see, however, though, that with the exception of Tacitus,
Absolutely.
Cassius Dio and
A new
Eusebius
word
are
for the
writing
chat
quite a bit
for next
after
time.
the event.
Xenoarchaeology, the study of alien civilizations and their artifacts, possibly through exploration of other planets or moons. I'm going to leave on this one last point.
The war beginning. Now,
What
I really
is
want to
hateful
focus
to you,
on the years 69
do
and
not do
70
to
in
your fellow
particular.
man.
Although
This is the
the
whole law.
Genesis
The
of the war
rest
can really be
is mere
traced back much
commentary.
earlier.
This is a
Depending on where you
tractated
want to
word
start, but
the
I think
Talmud
it's more
from
reasonable to
Shabbat
start with
31.
the year
Thank you so much, Ari, for allowing me to be here. World peace to everyone. Shalom, and we'll talk soon. Ari, thank you.
Shalom, my brother. You know we're going to DTM each other.
The
Today
local
is
co-curator is a name and guest.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Make this go viral. Share with everyone you know.
Let's get it. Let's go viral, man. Power Rabbi, man. Let's get it, boys. Thank you for your time, bro. Thank you for your
He
time.
had a base on
Shout
the
out to
coast.
Rabbi,
There was
everybody.
a much
Follow
more
Viral Rabbi,
Roman
Viral Rabbi.
flavored city called Caesarea or Caesarea in Hebrew that was actually built by Herod or significantly renovated by Herod. And from there, he would issue various proclamations that deeply offended the Jewish sensibilities, particularly in Jerusalem, where they were, for example, very much opposed to the setting up of images like Roman standards and things like that. But I guess his Flores really could not care less. Several other instances where the Jews felt that Justice Flores really did not have their best interests at heart. There were numerous armed conflicts, especially between the region of Galilee and the north, and then increasingly in Jerusalem, there was conflict with
I should mention that not only was David a decorated Navy SEAL, but he also graduated from
the way things worked out over the years 66, the Romans decided to send in a legion of soldiers from the north under the rule of Cestius Gallus, and he marched down. He actually set up shop outside Jerusalem, and he could have put it under siege or attacked it from
challenging child and
clear.
young
He
adulthood.
decided that
His home was
perhaps
abusive,
his
his school
presence
environment
there
was
had
abusive.
made a
He
statement that
essentially
one
had
always
no
had
positive
reasons
resources
nearby,
directed
and he
his way.
decided to
And in his
retreat.
20s, he found
And
himself
on it,
to be
really, I don't think it was
obese. That
seen
is
as
more
a
than
retreat.
300
Really,
pounds
were
working a job
movements at the time.
undisguised for
But on the way
minimum
back,
pay.
he was
And it was at
ambushed
that point
very cleverly
that
by
David
the
began an inner
zealots
dialogue
led
that
by
forced him
Elazar ben
to
Shimon
explore
and
the
Shimon
demons
bar
born
Giora
out of
in
his childhood,
particular,
but
who
also the
attacked
position that
his
he found
baggage
himself in as a
train
young
and
man.
actually
And then
destroyed it.
began the
And
journey
Cestius
to
Gallus,
navigate
although
that
he
dialogue and
survived and
transform
managed to
himself
make his
into
way
the Navy
back
SEAL,
to
the
Rome
ultramarathon runner,
very
the
briefly
best-selling
before he
author,
passed
and
away.
the extraordinarily
It was
positive and
humiliating
influential
to
man
see
that he is
that
today.
these
As some of
ragtag
you may know,
bands of
David
zealots,
has
of
done various
rebels,
public
who
lectures. He's a
were not
familiar face
representing any
online.
official faction
There's so
other than
many
kind of like
clips of him on
the
YouTube,
hooligans
and
of
he
time.
has
They
done
nevertheless
podcasts
were able to
before.
defeat
However,
a Roman legion
I'm certain that you'll
at
find
this
today's
path shown
discussion
known as the
to
Path
be
of Grace
very
Rome.
different
This
than previous
obviously got
podcasts
Rome's
that
attention.
David has been featured on.
They decided to
The
take
reason is that,
still
of course, we
more
get into his
stringent
accomplishments and we
measures,
talk
and they would
about
ultimately
the
send him
mindset
to
that allowed
Vespasian.
him to achieve those
Meanwhile,
things.
in Jerusalem,
But today,
as the
David really
conflict
lets us under
against
the
his
hood.
Florus
He
is
lets us
escalating,
into the
and
form of inner
Cestius
dialogue
Gallus is sent
that he has to
packing,
embrace,
there's
that he has to
more
grapple with on
radical
a daily
activity.
basis,
An
sometimes
individual named
multiple times
Menachem
throughout the day and
attacked
night,
the Roman base
in
at
order to
Masada,
impose the
and
sort of
he
self-discipline that he is
seizes
so
all
well
of
known
their
for.
weaponry, which
We
was
also
a
get into
really
some of the
amazing
scientific
thing as well.
mechanisms
And then
underlying
he went
willpower,
to Jerusalem.
and we talk
There,
about David's
he
current
actually
endeavors that
murdered
include,
Ananias,
for instance,
a high
his own
priest,
exploration
which
of science and
tremendously
medicine, for which he has
scandalous
become
thing to do.
an intense
And there
scholar
were some
and practitioner.
significant
I should mention that
uprisings between
multiple times
the
throughout today's
general
discussion,
population,
you will
who,
hear
although they
curse
may not
words.
have agreed
Now,
with
David and I
what
both
the
acknowledge
high
that
priest
cursing
had
isn't
to
for
say
everybody,
and his policy
and
in
that
general,
cursing itself
they certainly
is
weren't
different
in
than
favor
cursing
of
at
having
somebody.
these outsiders
Nonetheless,
come in
we do
from the Judean
realize that
desert
many
and
people,
take over the city.
parents perhaps
One of the
especially,
things that happened
might
early
not
on
want
is
to
that
hear
they
cursing. If you don't
burned
want to
down
hear cursing, well
the
then this podcast
place where
episode
all
is
the
probably
local
not for you.
records
However,
for debts
if you are
were
comfortable
held.
with
And
cursing,
this
or if you can
indicates to
tolerate
some
it,
analysts
I
that there
assure
were
you, today's
strong
discussion
socioeconomic
is highly worthwhile.
elements to the
Before
early
we begin,
conflict
I'd like to
that
emphasize
they
that this
wanted to
podcast is separate from my
remove
teaching
all
and
of
research
the
roles at
records
Stanford.
of who
It
owed
is,
money to
however,
whom, so
part of my
they
desired
could
effort to bring zero
they
cost to
received
consumer
large
information
debt
about
amnesty.
science and science-related
Ananias'
tools to the
son,
general public.
named
In keeping
Elazar,
with that theme, I'd like
goes
to thank
and
the sponsors
murders
of today's
Menachem,
podcast.
who had
Our
murdered
first sponsor
Elazar's
is Now
father.
We Knew Venison.
With
Now
the
We Knew
end of
Venison is the most
Ananias, there
nutrient-dense and
was
delicious
basically
red
an
meat
end to the
available.
full
I've spoken
Roman
before on this
posture
podcast,
in
and there's general
Jerusalem,
consensus
and
that
things
most
just
people should
spiraled
strive to
further and
consume
further out of
approximately
control,
1
as we
gram
shall
of
see.
protein per pound of body
Rome
weight.
sends in
Now, when one
a
strives to
great
do that,
general,
it's important to
Vespasian,
maximize the
was
quality
founded
of that
to
protein intake
essentially
to the
restore
calorie
the
ratio,
honor
because
of
you don't want
Rome
to consume
after
excess of
Cestius
calories
Gallus had
when
lost
trying
it
to
and
get
was
that 1
attacked
gram of
by
protein per pound of body weight.
Bargiera
Now We Knew Venison
and
has an extremely
and,
high
he
quality
comes
protein to
into the
calorie
north,
ratio, so it
and
makes getting
he
that 1
takes
gram
his
of protein
time.
per pound of
He
body weight
arrives
extremely easy. It's also
in
delicious.
68, if I remember
Personally, I like the
correctly,
ground venison. I also like the venison steaks.
2 years
And then for
just
convenience,
essentially
when I'm on the road,
engaged in
I
much
like the
smaller
jerky. The
mock-up
jerky is a
activities
very high
in the
protein to
north,
calorie
wandering
ratio,
down to
so
the
it has
center
as
of the
much as
country.
10 grams of
He has
protein
plenty of
per
time
jerky
to
stick
see
and has something
Jerusalem,
like
but
only
he
like
ultimately
55
decides
calories. So
not
again,
to do
making it very easy to get
reasons
enough
that we
protein
shall
without
discuss
consuming excess
shortly.
calories.
But
If you
more
would like to try Now We
significantly,
Knew
when
Venison,
the
you
emperor
can go to
Nero takes his own life,
nowweknewvenison.com/Huberman
Vespasian
to
is
get
what
20%
is
off your
called
first order. Again,
Rome,
that's
where he
nowweknewvenison.com/Huberman to get 20% off. Today's episode is also brought to us by AeroPress. AeroPress is similar to a French press for making coffee, but is in fact a much better way to make coffee. I first learned about AeroPress well over 10 years ago, and I've been using one ever since. AeroPress was developed by Alan Adler, who was an engineer at Stanford, and I knew of Alan because he had also built the so-called aerobie frisbee, which I believe at one time, perhaps still now, held the Guinness Book of World Records for furthest thrown object. And I used to see Alan
looking at
parks around Palo Alto, testing out different different aerobie frisbees. So he was sort of famous in our community for developing these different feats of engineering that turned into commercial products. Now, I love coffee. I'm somebody that drinks coffee nearly every day, usually about 90 to 120 minutes after I wake up in the morning, although not always. If I'm going to exercise, I'll drink coffee first thing in the morning. But I love
coffee. And what I've personally found is that by using the AeroPress, I can make the best possible tasting cup of coffee. I don't know what exactly it is in the AeroPress that allows the same beans to be prepared into a cup of coffee that tastes that much better as compared to any other form of brewing that coffee, even the traditional French press. The AeroPress is extremely easy to use and it's extremely compact. In fact, I take it with me whenever I travel and I use it on the road in hotels, even on planes. I'll just ask for some hot water and brew my coffee or tea right there on the plane. If you'd like to try AeroPress, you can go to aeropress.com/Huberman. That's AeroPress.com/Huberman to get 20% off any AeroPress coffee maker. AeroPress ships anywhere in the USA, Canada, and over 60 other countries around the world. Again, that's aeropress.com/Huberman to get 20% off. Today's episode is also brought to us by 8 Sleep. 8 Sleep makes smart mattress covers with cooling, heating, and sleep tracking capacity. I've spoken many times before in this podcast about the fact that sleep is the foundation of mental health, physical health, and performance. Now, a key component of getting a great night's sleep is that in order to fall and stay deeply asleep, your body temperature actually has to drop by about 1 to 3 degrees. And in order to wake up feeling refreshed and energized, your body temperature actually has to increase by about 1 to 3 degrees. One of the best ways to make sure that those temperature changes occur at the appropriate times, at the beginning and throughout the end of your night when you wake up, is to control the temperature of your sleeping environment. And that's what 8 Sleep allows you to do. It allows you to program the temperature of your mattress and sleeping environment such that you fall and stay deeply asleep easily and wake up each morning feeling incredibly refreshed and energized. I've been sleeping on an 8 Sleep mattress cover for almost 3 years now, and it has dramatically improved the quality of my sleep. If you'd like to try 8 Sleep, you can go to 8sleep.com/Huberman to get $150 off your POD3 mattress cover. 8 Sleep currently ships in the USA, Canada, UK, select countries in the EU, and Australia. Again, that's 8sleep.com/Huberman. And now for my discussion with David Goggins. David Goggins, welcome.
Man, good to see you again, man.
Great to see you. It was late 2016, early 2017, I believe, when you were in my lab at Stanford.
Yes, sir.
We did a little work later that day down in San Jose. And gosh, see you everywhere, but it's not enough. So great to have you here.
Thanks for having me on, bro.
You embody discipline and doing hard things.
Right.
Just start right off.
Let's just go there.
Right before we went hot mics, we were talking about learning.
Right.
Right now, you're spending some time learning and doing things that I think most people probably don't typically associate David Goggins with.
Right.
Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, most people just look at me as the guy that runs and yells as he's running. And that's, well, I do that, to motivate people. But people don't understand that my day is broken up into segments. I work out, I eat, I sleep, I spend most of my time studying. So, like, I'm in the medical world. I'm a paramedic in Canada. But I spend a lot of my time trying to nuke every single thing about it because I'm not trying to just be a paramedic, learn about veins and arteries and how the heart pumps and stuff like that. I'm trying to learn to the point where I can save someone's life. And even though paramedics are doing that all over the world, I'm trying to be that paramedic that can really dissect exactly what's going on and figure out, what medication goes where. Just trying to learn the algorithm of what's going on. So I spend a lot of time with it.
I love the word algorithm because when I teach biology or trying to learn anything that's related to biology, especially the human body, I need to know the nouns, but it's the verbs that matter. That's really what you're talking about. Like just saying that sits there, that brain part there, doesn't tell you how it all works together. So what does your process for studying look like? Like when we dropped a camera in the room, a microphone into your inner dialogue. Gosh, wouldn't we all love that? But we dropped a microphone into your inner dialogue. Are you waking up looking at the books and going, yeah, fresh day, let's learn? Or is some of the same resistance that you've talked about coming up around physical work, is that coming up from time to time?
You know what? I was nervous at first. I'm gonna keep it.
murdered Ananias,
I'm
the
not a
high
real
priest
smart
at the
guy.
time, and Elizabeth
And what I
was
mean by
another
that is,
of
I was
these
born with
zealot forces who are
ADHD.
especially feared by
My
the
brain
Sadducees
cannot
because
retain
they're
information.
in there and they're
I'm
trying
not some
to take
genetic
over
freak
the
when it comes to
old
running, when it comes to lifting weights.
Perhaps
I
for
am
many of the
absolutely the bottom of
socioeconomic
the barrel.
that we described
And
earlier.
people
On the
will
other
never
side of
believe,
the
and
ideological
they can
come
just
from the
never,
Pharisees
ever
and the
believe what you want to
Sadducees
believe.
is, of course, the
So when you ask me
Pharisees.
this question
And I use this
about
particular
what
19th
does
century
studying
image
look
to
like,
illustrate that because the Pharisees
I
are
have to
generally
go over
regarded
the
as
same page
the
over and
progenitors of the
over
later
and
rabbis,
over
the
and
rabbinic
over again.
movement
While
comes
Jennifer can look
from
at that
the
page
Pharisees.
while she's,
The
you know,
term
quizzing
Pharisee
me,
is
she'll learn
sometimes
right then. And she
mentioned
don't
in
know
a
anything about it.
derogatory sense,
She will quiz
perhaps
herself,
derived
quiz
from
me,
particular reading
and
of the
learn it as she's
Gospels in
quizzing
which
me.
Pharisees
It's
are
the most
often
frustrating thing in the world how my brain
during
works.
debate with
So
Jesus.
what I do is I
But it
literally
is
sit there
basically a
with a pen and
translation
paper,
to Hebrew term
and I have
Pharisee,
my books,
meaning those
and I
who
go through and
separate.
have to write everything
Separated in
down.
the sense that they
Every
separated from
single
official
day,
authority,
I
from
was
the
studying the
Herodian
same
aristocracy,
page
from
until
the
it's
Romans, and so on.
photographic memory.
Josephus takes
From
pains to
writing the
note
same thing
that the
down,
Pharisees
and then
are,
from there
by
I'll
and
go
large,
back
the
through and
most
relearn
popular
again.
party,
So
that
I'll
they
learn
have the
the
support
bulk of it,
of most of the
but then I'll
countryside,
go through and learn
who are
the
alienated
small
by the violence
things
of the
within that.
zealots,
So if it's a medication,
and the
I'll learn what
despair
the
of
medication
any
does.
effective leadership
I'll
from
first
the
I'll learn how to
Herodians.
even say the
So the
medication.
Pharisees are kind of like
Because these medications aren't like,
the natural leadership of
albuterol.
the
No,
broader
it's
masses,
very big
but they
words. So I'll
have
go
no
through and learn how
other
to say the name.
official
And I'll go
power
through,
base
learn
other
what the
than
dose is.
the sort of
Then I'll go
charismatic
through, and this is like
spiritual
every
leadership.
single day. It's not,
They are
I
at
got it.
this time
Let's just
in
go through.
an
No, nothing
uneasy
is I got it.
alliance, however,
Every
with
single thing.
what some scholars
So
call the
I
Peace
I
Party,
can't wait to get this
and the
conversation.
Peace
It's
Party
everything I
basically
do in life.
includes the Herodians
It
and the
sucks.
Sadducees.
Everything
The
I do in
Sadducees
life,
are
it sucks. That's why when I was 300
ideological
pounds and
enemies of the
24 years old,
Pharisees. The Sadducees, for
it wasn't
example,
like I had some big
deny
epiphany
the existence of an
let's just go
afterlife,
be a
something
Navy
which
SEAL.
is
Let's
very
lose some weight.
core
No,
to
I knew my
Pharisaic
entire
theology.
life
The
was going to be a
Pharisees
struggle,
and the
which
Sadducees
is why I just
are
ignored
unhappy
it.
about
I said,
how
I'm not
the
even
Pharisees
trying to
have
jump
taught the
off
power of the Sadducees
into this shit and
control
learn
the
how to
so on.
read, how
So
to write, how to
it's
memorize,
surprising to
how
see
to
them in an
become
alliance,
something
but what
I
they
am
all
not.
agree on
But
is
through
that
that
the
process,
level of communal
something
violence
happened.
that has been
And I
penetrated
realized
Jerusalem
this is
is
why
getting
I
out
feel
of
sorry
hand,
for
and
no
they have
one.
to find a way
In this
to
podcast, they're
scale
going
it
to
back,
really
even
not
if
like
that
me
means putting
because
up with Roman
people are going to
domination.
think
The
that I
most
am
important leader of the
maybe
Pharisees, for our
lying
purposes, is
or maybe
undoubtedly
fibbing
Rabbi Yochanan ben
or
Zakkai,
exaggerating.
who
No, I am
in
literally,
a
I
very
was the
dramatic
lowest
passage,
form
which
on
is
earth.
echoed
No
in
talent,
Josephus,
no
but with
ability
different
to
players.
learn. And
Rabbi
I
Yochanan ben
literally know
Zakkai
what it is
manages
to
to
rock bottom
fool
and to build that
the
up.
zealots, who
So
are
that
called
question about
Puritan
learning
in the
is a
text
pain in my
of the
ass.
Talmud that
I
describes
don't
the
have to
Talmud.
do it.
He manages to
Just think
fool
about it.
them
I'm 49
into
years old and I'm a
allowing him
multi-millionaire.
to leave Jerusalem
I
and
don't
actually
have to do
speak and
anything.
negotiate
So all I
with
thought
the
about when I was
Roman
growing up is,
authorities,
man,
and he does so
I can't
by
wait to
faking
one
his
day
own
get to the
death
point
and pretending
where I no
to be
longer have to do
a
this stuff.
coffin and a corpse.
But what happened as I
The
got
zealots
older,
actually don't
it
believe it
became
at first, and
weightlifting.
they
So how I
ram
do every
iron
day is how I
rods
do every
through
day.
the
It's
coffin
a discipline,
to
it's a
be sure
regimen,
that he is in fact dead.
it was a
Miraculously
choice I
survives
made.
that. He's taken
And the
outside
choice
the
I made
walls
was,
of Jerusalem,
what
where
are
he
you
meets
willing
with
to
Vespasian,
sacrifice,
tells him
and what are
that
you willing to give
he
up
will one day
to
be
find
emperor, and
every bit of who
Vespasian,
you are as a human being?
impressed with
And I
his
was willing to give
prophetic
everything to
statement.
do that.
Again, this
So
passage is
studying is
mentioned
no
in
joke.
Josephus as
I
well.
love that you're studying. I
Josephus is
recall a
just
few
over
years
there,
ago I heard
and happens in the north, not in the south.
someone interviewed or
But
podcasted
Rabbi
you,
Yochanan
and
ben
you just threw
Zakkai
out,
says, okay, I want
I don't
three
know what I'll
things.
do next. Maybe
The
I'll
one
be a
that's especially
scientist.
important
And
for us
I'm
is
like,
he says,
I was like,
give
because I
me
knew,
Yavne
because I
and
know you a bit,
Crusaders.
right? I see your work out there.
Let
We
me
met
have
before
the
that
city of Yavne,
if
which
you
is,
decided that
at the
you were
time
going to do
was
it,
called
right? And
Yavne,
learning
here,
medicine, which
in
is is what you're doing, right? Learning human physiology is so detailed. And people out there have to understand, when you look at a textbook and you see the veins and the capillaries, different colors, when the body's open, they're not different colors, right? So, I mean, some things have different color contrast, but it's not like it's all labeled when you pop it open. Exactly. And so the process of writing things down by hand is important. Do you go back and read those notes? Do you think about that stuff on your runs too? Or are you segmenting your day? Like when you're done studying, are you heading out for a run and thinking about other things, or are you still rehearsing material in your head?
So when I write it down, and I'm able to. I'm actually looking down at this paper right now.
back to,
Who
right?
knows
So
how
I'm
many
actually there right
hundreds
now,
of
speaking to
people,
you.
perhaps
I write it
thousands,
down
but
in a
that
way
seems like a
that
stretch.
I'm memorizing
But
page
it's
69.
definitely a small number,
So
primarily
I write it down,
Jews
so then
who
writing it down and
rest
that
with
page sync
the
together in my
teachings
brain.
of Nazareth,
So I'm looking at the
and
book
believe
in my
that
brain right now.
a version
So, like,
of Judaism
that's just how
that
it works
is
for me.
described
And I have
by
to do it
Paul in
over
particular
and
is
over again. So that
Judaism
page
to future
is stuck in
salvation.
my mind. So I'm literally
It's
flipping
kind of
through
at this time
pages
very much an
as I'm taking
amalgam
these
of
tests.
Judaism
And I'm
and
taking
what
these
would
national
become
tests to become a
Christianity,
paramedic
because
or
the
become
two
an
movements
advanced
have
EMT or
not
whatever. I'm
formally
literally, as I'm
separated
taking that
at this
test,
point. They
I'm going
definitely
through and I'm like,
are in, up until this point, they have
flipping
been
pages in my head
playing
where that
in the
page
same
was. And
spaces,
how I do that is just
observing
from
the same
how I
ritual
write it and
calendar,
how it's on the page. When I run,
regarding
I
as
can't
holding
recall
many
any
of
of
the
it.
same teachings.
I
But
cannot
over
I
the
cannot
century
bring any
after
of that
the
because I'm
crucifixion in
running.
particular,
How
there
my
will
mind
be
is
a
wired now
widening
is that
gap
everything I
that
do
separates the early
is
Jewish
what I
Christian
do.
movement from the
Because the
original
focus it
Jewish
takes for me
movement.
to, like right now,
It
I'm
will
running.
be
I'm not
exacerbated
like
by the
a great runner.
large
I'm not like
inclusion
injury
of
free. So like my
non-ethnic
first
Jews
20
in
minutes of the
early
run,
Christianity. As
I'm
Christianity
limping.
becomes much more
I'm
Gentile
literally limping
in
because I've
ethnic
had several knee
composition,
surgeries
there's much
and
more
my body was twisted.
reduced
And so now
tendency
it's
to
untwisted.
view
So
the
people
Jewish
look at me, oh,
origins
just
of
like he's
the
limping,
movement with
like limping when
the
he
same
runs.
level
I
of
am
charity,
limping.
and
My body's
that's
jacked
more
up, so
for
I'm
another
focusing
discussion
on how
today.
to get the
What happened
best
to those
out of a
Jewish
broken body.
Christians during the
So
time
everything I
of
do
the revolt?
is a total
Because
focus of what
Josephus
I'm
tells
doing
us
at that
nothing about them,
point.
probably
life.
because they are
So it
really
seems like you've really
small in size.
trained away
He will
or
have some
somehow
passing
gotten away
comments
from the
on
ADD that you mentioned.
Christianity in another
Because
book
what you
that he will
describe
write
is
later,
deep
called The
trench, or
Antiquities.
V-shaped
But
trench.
he
I imagine like it's a ball
tell
bearing.
us much about what was
And it can
going
only
on
go
with the
forward in
Christians
that
at this
trench.
time.
Right.
Or back when
Much
it
more
goes forward.
significant
It's not like
passage
sliding
occurs
around at
in
the like concave at the
Eusebius's
bottom.
massive
There's
church
like
history,
attention.
which was written
So it seems like you've
about
trained that
200
up.
years
Is
later.
there a similar
And
feeling
he
when you're in the
writes
full
in
focus
his
of running
introduction,
versus
for
full
example, that
focus of
his book
studying?
is
Does it kind
going
of
to
feel
be a
like, oh
history
yeah,
book
that's the
that
same
focuses
groove, a
primarily on
different thing?
things that
Or is it just a
didn't
completely
really
different
took the
world?
full
It's a
ethnos
completely different world.
because of their
So
plot
like it's
against
just
our Savior.
both of
Now,
them for me.
it's
It's
clear
suffering, but
from
suffering
that
a whole different
passage
way.
that Eusebius
Like when I was
has a
going through school,
particular
I'll
theological
never forget. I think I was in
interpretation of the
third
destruction
grade,
of the Second
and
Temple
back then,
that
you know,
is
ADD,
essentially
ADHD
blaming
wasn't like,
the
you know,
Jews
here's this
and
medicine,
their
here's this thing. They
downfall
want to put you in a special
because
school.
of how they treated
So
Jesus.
for me,
This is
I
not
was so far
an
behind in
argument that
learning
appears
that their big
in
thing was,
Josephus, but it
let's
will
just put him in a
appear
special school
significantly
because he'll never learn.
over many other theological
And
approaches.
through that process of like,
At
I
any
don't
rate,
want to be
let's answer
in
the
a
simple
special
question.
school.
Where were the Christians?
I don't want
According
to
to
be treated
Eusebius,
any
he
differently.
writes that
It really,
the
like,
people
I
of the
never
church
took
in
medication.
Jerusalem
I've
had
never
received
taken
some kind of
medication
a
for this.
prophecy given
That's
by
why right now you see me
oracle
looking right in your eyes.
before the
What the
war,
hell is
saying that
you know, it's you
we
the
should all
same
leave,
right now?
that it's going to be
And that's why I
dangerous,
don't
and
feel
they
bad
should
for people
flee. The
who
oracle
have
revealed
ADHD,
that
who
they
have
should
learning
flee
disabilities,
to a place
and
called
some
Pella,
aren't
which
possible
was either in the
because you just
Perea, that's
can't.
the phrase that
A lot of
Eusebius
them
used,
can.
and I'll show you a map in
And
a
but people
second.
don't
But
want to
according to
go
other
through the
historians,
process of
it was in the
focus,
Decapolis,
of
just on
teaching
the other
yourself how
side
to
of the Jordan
truly
River.
focus. This is where my
And
message gets
they
lost.
believe that this is
It
where
gets lost because
Christianity
I may
will
say,
be
you
preserved
know, MF or F,
during
whatever,
the
you know,
war. Here's
or
the
maybe
map.
because that's the passion
It shows you
that comes out of me, because
Jerusalem in the
that's,
south,
it
and
takes
here is Pella,
everything for me to
which
learn
is
a
clearly in the
sentence.
Decapolis, so there's some
So when I
questions about
speak
the
about
text
David
itself,
Goggins,
but
I
nevertheless,
can't
that's
speak about
what's
David
happened
Goggins
to
in
the
a way
Christians.
that's
They
just
apparently
calm
have
and cool.
no role in the
Because when I
story
wake up, I
that
know
he
the
is
journey
going
that
to
it takes for me to
describe.
find my greatness.
Okay.
And it's
Now we
hard.
should turn to some of the
Nothing is
main
easy. Nothing
zealots
just like,
who
oh, I wake
are
up and
very
I just do
active
this or I
and
do that. Or
fighting,
it just,
as we should see,
no, I
with
watch
the
people every day
Herodians,
go through life and it's so
Pharisees,
easy.
Sadducees, and
For me to be where I'm at
with
today,
each other.
it takes
John
every bit of
me. So when I speak about it, and as I get going here, you'll start seeing me, the tempo will rise, the passion will come out, because I'm back there. I'm doing what I do every day to become a human being. And so nothing is easy. Like running is running. It sucks. But you have a choice to make. Do you want to sit down and go back to that guy you once were? No. So this is what it takes. It takes that misunderstanding of people, and they'll never get it because they never gave it guidance. So that is what it takes for me to do what I do. It may take you something different. So for me, everything has to be in the study. Everything has to be in this. Everything has to be everywhere I am. It has to be there. Me, focus, right?
That's why you're my second podcast that does this Rogan since the book came out. I don't have time for that shit. Because if I want to be great, I'm not trying to maximize money or maximize people knowing me. I do these things because maybe someone out there will understand me
and it's
and
at this
get
time
it
then
and say, I can
John
grow with this
Scala
guy.
would
And others just
portray
won't.
himself as an ally.
Sounds like friction
to the high
is
priest
something you're
and not
very
as-
familiar with.
not
Just
the
this
same
word, just
person
I
as
feel like it's
Rodriguez
cast
Anonymous,
above us right now in
but
his face,
he would also-
highlighted,
he would also
underlined
be
letters.
maybe
Friction is
well.
friction. It's like you're
Josephus
up in the morning,
portrays John
and I
Scala
imagine
as kind of
David
like
Goggins going to the
pretending to
coffee
be
maker,
allied
stretching
with
out,
the
good morning,
Herodians
sunshine, and you're telling me
Sadducees,
from
peace party,
eyelids
but in
open,
reality feeding
there's friction.
information
Yes,
to the
and
zealots
that is the thing
so
that
that they
people
can be more
they don't
effective
fucking
in
get.
their attempt to take over
The
the city.
biggest misunderstanding
He
about David Goggins
ultimately
of all time
is successful
is
in
like, what do you
taking
believe
over
in
a
God or
large
not? I
band
do.
of followers of
He
another
put this
than
lab
Shimon,
rat, which
so
is
his forces grow
on this
very
planet,
large. And
is a
also, we should remember at this time that
fucking
there's
sea
different populations
with a
entering
beat up,
Jerusalem. Not
abused
only
kid who
the
can barely
pilgrims
learn,
arrive in
barely
Jerusalem in
learn,
large numbers
who has a
for
twisted
the
body, messed up
holiday of Pesach,
messed
for
up
example, and the
genetics,
holiday of
sickle
Sukkot.
cell, this
Josephus
and that.
describes this in some detail.
Let me give him
But also
everything
there are
that
war
pretty much
refugees
disqualifies
because
you
there's
from the military.
the
But
Roman
back then,
incursion to the
it wasn't
north
estrus.
and
And let's
chaos
put him
going
in
on there.
this
And in the
and see
south,
what
you
comes out.
have these zealots
So to do
wandering
that,
around,
friction.
and people are fleeing
You
their
don't wake
homes,
up in the
looking
morning
to
time
the
to go
big
to the coffee
cities, hoping
maker.
to find some
Matter of fact,
safety.
sometimes you don't even sleep.
But John of the
What it
Scala
requires
ultimately will
is when I'm at 2 o'clock in the,
his
it's 2 o'clock in the morning,
allies, the
and my
Herodian
brain is thinking
aristocracy,
about a fucking
and will
drug.
ultimately be the person
And
in
I gotta
charge
get
of
up and
the
look in my
courtyard.
to
And
see
he
if
will
that drug is how
invite
I remember.
Yochanan ben Tzvi,
And this is
who's just another one
every
of these
day
bandit
of my
leaders
fucking
who
life. That's why I'm not
takes
trained a
pride in
fighter.
personally
Or I train someone, I'm
murdering
like, we have no fucking idea how
the
great you really
Herodians
are.
that he comes across.
Because
These, by the way, of
you
course,
are
are all
using
Jews. He's
such
an entirely
minimum
Jewish infighting
minimum of what you have.
at this point. And
And
now,
if people
to
can learn
understand
to
how this
focus,
unfolds, we really have to see a
this is
little
what's
bit
possible. While
of the
it may
map
not be pretty,
of
like people want to do a
Jerusalem
documentary.
itself to understand
No,
where these various forces
I want to do a
are
documentary.
gathered. So here's an
Because I
aerial
will have
view
normal,
of the city of
everyday
Jerusalem
people
as it
picking me
appeared
apart.
in the first
Oh, his
century.
life is
And you
miserable.
can see the
Who
kind
wants
of
to live like
wavy,
that?
squiggly lines
Dude,
are
it's
topographic
crazy
in
how
nature.
it's almost like he's
That
sick, he's
when they are
psychotic.
closer together, like in the Kidron Valley, which is in
The
the
most frustrating thing
lower
for
right
me
corner, that
is when
means
more
a
people judge
steeper
a man
incline,
like
and
myself.
when they are further
It
apart,
really
it means
takes
more of a plateau. So
extract
built on several of
greatness
these
from nothing.
plateaus, and
It takes
there are some
every bit
significant
of who you are
geographic
if you choose
separations
that
by the
route.
valleys that are in there.
If you
So
don't,
we're going to look at the
Merry
Temple
Christmas.
Mount,
Do what you got to
which
do.
is located
But
here on
yeah,
this
all these
particular
things for
plateau.
me,
We're also going
like,
to look
like
at
I told you, I'm gonna keep it real.
this
I'm
tower
not coming
called
here
the
to talk
Antonia
about like,
Tower, which
you know,
is the most
perform without
significant
purpose.
military
Because I go
fortification
through,
of
I
the
write these
temple grounds
books,
itself.
I
It
go
was
through and try to
actually
dumb down
home
David Goggins.
to a contingent
How
of
can I
soldiers
give
at
normal
several
people,
points
and I'm
in
normal,
the war, and
but I
it
found
is
something that
the
most
base
don't
from
want
which
to
most of the
How
military
can I
activity
speak
was
to people and
achieved.
give them
We also
something
have
from
this
this
region called the lower
crazy
city,
psychotic brain that I've
and of
developed? How
course
can I
this
give them
higher
that?
class area
So I
called the
sit down
upper
with
city,
Jennifer
where
for
Herod
years
had actually
and
built
write
his
down
own palace.
perform without
There are also
purpose.
several
Callous your
walls
mind.
around Jerusalem.
Armor your
There
mind.
is the
The
so-called
cookie jar.
first wall,
The
which
accountability.
is kind of an
Shit that
extension
people can
of
fucking use in
the,
their lives.
the wall surrounding
No.
the Temple Mount itself
No.
that
I'm glad it
encapsulates
helps
the
you.
upper city and
But
the lower
the
city.
barbaric life
and
that I
so it's
live,
a
that
larger
you have to
expression
live,
of
the
Temple
almost
Mount
obsession
itself.
that you must
And
have to
then
be
a
great.
second wall was
You
built
can't put that
that
shit in the
protects the
fucking book, bro.
Antonia
You can't
and
put it.
reinforces
You can't.
some of the northern
You can't write
suburbs.
about it.
And
It has to
finally,
be experienced. It
especially
has to
as
be
the
experienced.
population
And you can't even,
Jerusalem would grow,
after you
a
experience
third
it,
wall was built
to write it in the book,
far outside. In fact, that
it would
was
seem like easily
penetrated
locked
very
down.
early on by the
This
Romans.
ain't too gory. It's
And
too
so now
gory.
that
It
we have
makes
a
sense.
little
We
bit of
got it.
geography, we're
Everything,
going to
every second of the day,
some of the major
he
players.
is trying to
The high
extract more
priests
from
and
something.
the Pharisees, again, this
He's
is one of those,
constantly thinking,
this is
he's
the peace
constantly,
party, this is
constantly
the
disciplined, never going off
unusual,
the path.
you know,
Whenever it's
coming
injured on
together are of
he figures a way.
ideological enemies
It's
saying,
a conqueror's
we may
mindset.
disagree about a lot of things, but we certainly can't
very
have
few people
fighting in
in
the
you
streets.
But you
They
really understand
call
what that
upon
is.
the larger population
Like,
to repudiate
almost
the
50
zealots. who
And
are
I've been this way
actually
for almost
engaged
30
in
years.
wide-scale
Like,
massacres.
who you for fun?
The Zealots
never,
end up taking over
these
the
questions,
temple
I don't get them. I
where
don't
they
understand them. I
become
don't.
trapped.
So, yeah,
They
I get asked that
can't get
sometimes
out
when you
of the
finally start
multiple
listening to all this
walls.
stuff like
This is their
podcasting,
only
reading,
base
right,
for
working out.
self-defense. They
But
do manage to
so some of that
sneak
resonates,
out
but
in
I think
messenger,
what's
however,
so
who goes to the
truly
south
unusual
to
about what you're describing, your
infant
process,
population and
is
ask
that,
the Idumeans
you know,
for
from
support,
go,
claiming
it's
that
hard. Yep. And I have
they
to
have
ask,
been
was being
oppressed,
300
like
pounds,
the Idumeans,
having
by the
the I'm using the
aristocracy,
word
by
you
the
described.
Herodians,
You said it
and
before.
when
You
they
had a tendency at one point in your life, early on, to tell lies, try and get people's approval.
Idumea is here in the south.
Crazy haircuts,
Israel.
attention seeking,
It's
and
an unusual
yet
part
all
of
of
Jewish
that
history because
triggered
this is the
something
only time
that
when
now is
Israel engaged in
extraordinary.
any form of forced
Do
conversion.
you think
And in
those
fact,
hardships
after the
were necessary to flip
incident,
the switch?
it was decided to
I don't know
never
if they were
again
necessary,
engage in
but
forced
it was
conversion.
something
This
that
is
made
something
me
that
feel
occurred under
I
one
didn't
of
feel
the
good.
Maccabean kings, the
It was easy.
Hasmoneans, and
The
among
brain
the
that I
many
was given
negative
as a child,
results of
it was
this
easy
was
to go
the
home and think
birth of
about
Herod,
how do I want to be a
whose
French
father
daddy?
was an Idumean.
How do I want to
So
show
it
up to
was
school
widely
today?
regarded in
It
rabbinic
didn't
thought
require me
that
going home
the
and
whole
opening a
idea
book
of
up, say,
forcibly converting any
it's
population
going to take me all year to
was
learn
just
this.
a bad one to start with, and
So
Herod
instead
was
of learning that
the
page,
punishment that the Jews
I
received
learned
for it.
how to
At any rate, you have this
become a
population in the
character.
south that identifies as Jewish,
Maybe
but
that character that I
recognizes
created, that
their
300-pound
distinctiveness from the
insecure
Judeans
guy
per
that used to
se.
fake
There
it till I
are
make it
constant
type of guy,
discussions
yo,
about
let me
patrilineal
become your
descent
friend,
and
let me lie to you
matrilineal
until you
descent
like
in
me
this
type of
context,
guy.
but again, not for this short
When you
presentation.
have any kind
And
of
the Idumeans find
any man,
themselves taken in by the
a human
argument that the
being,
Zealots offer
a
that
soul, a
they're
spirit,
being
any,
persecuted
I
by
had no,
the
I must have
aristocracy. The
this
Idumeans
much
also have
pride.
a kind of a feeling
Because
that
that's
they're
exactly
often
what
looked down
Oprah
upon
does.
and are
Because
persecuted. So
every
they
day you
send
were a character, every day you
20,000
were a clown,
soldiers
every day
to
you
rescue
opened
the
that
Zealots in Jerusalem.
Spanish book or that
These numbers
science
that
book or
Josephus
English book, you
offers
like when you looked
have
at it, it's like
often
it
been
looked like
challenged,
a
and
foreign
you have to
language.
take them with a grain of
And
salt.
you're sitting, where
But
do I start?
even if it's a
Where
significant
do I
fraction
start?
of 20,000, it's still going to be a lot of people.
Obviously, it
When
was
they get to
necessary. The more I
Jerusalem,
talk about it, it was necessary because what
they
happened
are
is I became
held off
haunted
by the city walls,
by the mere
and
fact
the
that
high
this is my
priest
existence.
Ananus comes out and says,
And
"Hey, you know,
you got to live with that.
please
And I
understand
looked
what's
at it for
going
a lot
on
of
here,"
years.
and he makes an
And so I sat back
impassioned
and said,
speech
okay,
saying, "We are
all right,
not,
I know
oppressing the
this text. And when you
Zealots. They've
sit
come
back,
in here, they've committed violence, and
as fucked
this
up
is
as I
not
was,
good
and
for us. If the Romans
I had
see
a
us all
laundry
fighting with
list,
each other,
a
it's
table
just
like
going to
this
weaken
of
our
what
movement."
I have
And
to do to
he
become
tries
just a
very,
human being
with
that can
tremendous
make
effort to
ends
keep
meet,
the Idumeans out
that can
of the
make
city.
$1,000 a
He
month
is
just to get
unfortunately
there. It's like,
unsuccessful
oh my
because
God,
one of the
dude,
Zealots
how did
slips out of the city
I'm
once
16,
again
17,
and
I can't
actually
read, I can't
opens
write,
up the city gates
and
for the
I,
Idumeans.
oh
And
my
this is
God, I'm
when
so behind the
the
power curve. My
violence
brain is
just
about
gets much,
being
much worse.
depressed, and my
The
dad,
Idumeans
my mom's
enter,
not home,
and
and
together with the
kids are
Zealots, they
calling me nigger at
massacre the
school,
high
and I'm
priest
like, oh my
Ananus,
God, man, what
and
the fuck do
this
I
actually
do?
happened on the temple grounds.
And it wasn't like someone came
Josephus
around and said, hey, man,
considers this the
you can
point
do
of
this.
no return for
This is all
Jerusalem,
me.
meaning
So we
before
don't know,
the
where does this
Idumeans
cold
and the
man come
Zealots
from?
murdered the Cohen
I'm not trying to
Gadol,
be cold.
Josephus felt that
It's the
maybe
reality of my
the
life.
Judeans could
It's the
patch
reality
it up
of
with
a
the
lot of people.
Romans, saying sorry about
And so,
those Zealots, sorry that we
yeah,
couldn't,
that had to happen for me to be
destroy
haunted.
Cestius's
To be
Gallus'
haunted,
legion
to pull
and
out,
things
to
like that. Really, we
extract it,
didn't
God,
mean
in the
those
day.
things.
That
But once
haunting
the high
is
priest
something that's
Ananus was
still there today.
murdered,
Because no
the
matter how much you
population
improve, no matter how
descended
much
to
you change who you
a
are,
whirlpool of
it's
violence,
not
and there would be
permanent.
no one left to
You just
adequately
wake up and
defend
say,
the Jewish
oh my
cause
God, man,
in
you're
front of the Romans, and he felt that
You're
at that
David
point really
Goggins. You break records. You do this. You do that.
the
People know
violence extended
how are
beyond
you
the
able to
attacks
just
on Herodians, but
be so
it went
hard
into the
and
civil
never turn the
civilian
fucking thing
areas
off?
as well.
Because once it
The
turns
local
off,
defenses of Jerusalem, the
I
civilian
go right
militia
back
was
to the David
attacked
Goggins that
and
is.
overwhelmed by the
And
that's the guy
and
that I'm
also
constantly fighting every day.
door-to-door attacks
And
on
it's a
the general
choice.
population.
And that choice
happened
makes
at
you
this point.
misunderstood. It makes you
The
crazy. That's why
Indians and the Zealots
I
simply
hate
run
fucking
around
social
amok
media.
and
In
raping and killing
2013,
as they went.
people wanted me to write
To
my
give
book.
one example of the level of lawlessness, the Zealots
And the reason why I
wanted
didn't do
to
it,
put
I
a
sat at the table
particular
when Jennifer was
prominent
there.
individual named
This
Zacharias
before
on
she
trial,
started working for me. I started dating her,
and they
whatever.
convened a Sanhedrin,
And all these
a
people,
grand
they're like,
jury
man, you
of
gotta go on
71
social media.
members, to
And I was like,
convict
fuck
him
you,
of
man.
the crimes they
Like,
accused
I'm
him of.
not,
But the
it's poison.
Sanhedrin did not
It's
want
poison
to go
because
along with
I
this,
knew
and so
what I did
instead the
to
zealots
get where I
simply
am.
slit his
And I'm going to
throat
have these
and
people,
threw his
these
body
normal,
into the
everyday
valley
people,
over the city of
fat,
Gaza. So
lazy,
kind of
is
extreme
exactly who I
lawlessness
was,
going on at this time.
judging me.
And then, finally,
And I know
it
it,
gets
I
so
was
bad
once
that
them.
even the Idumeans
All my
neglect their
hard
role,
work, all my
and they
dedication, I'm
say,
going to have some normal
wait a
dude
minute, we came
get his
here
little brownies,
because
little ding dong, ho
we
ho,
thought we were
Twinkie,
being oppressed,
sit
but now we
there
see
with his
that you are the
coffee,
oppressors,
picking
and
me
they
apart.
decide to leave.
Oh, he
They
must
leave
be
in
unhappy.
disgust.
He's in.
Before
You
they
know
leave, they release
how
all
hard
the
it is to put these
prisoners,
shoes on every damn
and
morning. I don't
many
have
of them
you
end up
pick me
going to
apart.
join another one of the
So,
zealots, Shimon
yeah,
Bar
there's
Yoria,
there's
who is also
so
active
much
at
that
this time.
goes
This
into
particular
this
coin
that I was like,
shows
fuck this. I
possibly
never
Shimon
want
Ben
anything to do with it.
Yoria led
So,
off in chains
anyway,
by Vespasian. You can see on the
I'm not a
right
psychologist,
there, there,
but knowing your story from what you've written, what you've said on social media and elsewhere podcasts, and here now especially, right? It's amazing to me.
Up until this time,
And frankly, it pulls at my heartstrings a little bit. I realize that's not what you're trying to do, but that in the course of your childhood and in your young adulthood, that no one ever got between you and the world. I forget where I heard it, that like if a kid has just one person that believes in them, right? You know, and I had my trials and tribulations, but I had great coaches, great mentors. I attached to them. I found them if they didn't necessarily find me. But I'm realizing that your situation was no one's ever said, hey, I'm going to stand here next to you or get in front of you, put a shield up.
And quite often just
And so
it's
almost
sending
like
them back to send a
you've got
message
these different
further.
it's all you, but there's versions of yourself
The
that like
zealots
you knew
are
on
actually
social media.
afraid
Like,
of
I
the
don't know that I
zealots
have
of
the
Jerusalem.
wherewithal
They
in
actually
2013,
try
14, 15, 16, 17
threaten him into
to get in
submission
front of
by
myself while
kidnapping
doing
his
all
wife.
this
Right?
because
These
I've
are all,
already got so much going on
Jews
here.
fighting each
Is that
other.
about right?
That is
right,
fighting
but
each
I
other at
developed
this
a lot of
time. The
anger.
Herodians are largely
I still have
replaced. The
It'll never
Pharisees
go
have
away
decamped, the Christians have
for
decamped the
the
Christians.
normal human beings. in this
But
world.
when they kidnap his wife,
Because when
he
you put
actually
yourself
comes
in
up
the
to the
sewer,
walls of
like I
the
was
city
in,
of Jerusalem
please,
and
if someone
puts on
save me,
such a
come out
tantrum
and
that the zealots
announce
are
it to the
actually
world.
afraid of
There's
him
no one.
standing outside the walls yelling
There's
at
no
them, and they release
So
his wife,
when you
hoping
know
that
that,
perhaps he won't be
and
mad
then
after
I
all.
was sitting at a
He
table
ends
with all
up
these
being
smart
part of the
people who tell
invasion
me what to
of
do and shit,
Jerusalem,
and guiding me
spring
through
of
my life
69,
now.
along with the Idumeans,
When I'm
and he ends
40
up
fucking years old,
dominating
and
the lower
2000,
and the upper
I don't know,
cities
40
with
something years
them.
old now,
Here
49.
is the map of
And I'm
Jerusalem
looking at them
again,
all, and they're
you
now
can see
trying to
that
guide me
the
on
forces
what's right.
are arrayed in three
On
major
this
areas.
poison.
Lazar ben
And
Shimon,
so,
one
yeah,
of the
what you
early
say is right,
zealots we spoke
but
about,
for
is
me,
actually
it was
in
more
the
of,
temple
I know
itself.
now.
John of
I
Giscala
don't need
is
you to
controlling the
guide
temple
my
courtyard,
future.
and there are like
I know
rings
what's
of
good
walls
for
that
me and
protect
what's
them
bad
from each
for me.
other. And
And
Shimon
for
Bar
me, it took
Yoria
every bit
is
of focus I could. I know
controlling
social
most of
media.
the upper and
That's why
lower
people love to
cities,
go on
where most of the people
because they
of
want to show
Jerusalem
you the
live.
good side.
And it's a three-way
of life.
fight between these
I'm going
three
to teach you
zealot
good side
forces.
of life.
The Herodians are,
So I
are
just figured out a way
sidelined
when
at
I
this
came out
point,
in 2016
and they're
of
simply
teaching you
waiting for the Romans to
what
come.
life really is
Let's
for the
understand what
majority of
happens
us
in the
is hell.
context of that.
And so, while
So,
people love to show you the
the
cars
fight
and the
becomes
house
so
and the
intense
vacations
between
and
these
shit,
three zealot
all that's good.
forces that they
All that's
actually
happy.
attack each
I want to
other's
show you
stores of
the
grain
side that I know
and
most of you are
grain,
going through.
hoping that
And
they will
people
weaken
hide
each
very well.
other
I
by
don't want to hide
preventing
anymore.
them
I hid it
access
for
to
24
food
fucking
stuff.
years.
And this was such an
That's why now, like I
incredibly
told you, we can
stupid
talk about
and
anything we want.
short-sighted
Because as
strategy,
human beings,
because
the one thing,
Romans are going
the
to
first thing we
use
have to learn,
hunger
also
as
stutter
their
real bad
primary
growing up.
weapon.
So you hear
But
me
by
stutter every now and then.
destroying
It's because
the
that was
grain
part of my
storage
life also.
of each of their opponents,
So it's
they have
funny,
no way
human
to
beings want to show you the best side,
ultimate,
and they want to hide the worst side.
Especially
For me,
Titus,
I'm
who
going
will
to teach you how to
be
be
very
vulnerable.
much involved at this point.
That's the only way to
Vespasian
fix
has
yourself.
actually gone back to
You don't
Rome
fix
by
yourself
now,
by coming out
but
here
Titus
and me
is
selling
following
you
the
some
same
fucking
strategy,
books. That's why
taking his
I don't have,
time,
I forgot
making
about it.
forays around the
I'm glad
north
people
central
got
part of
something
Israel,
from
down into the south of Israel, but he
I
won't
want
attack
you to
Jerusalem
learn
until he is
that the only way
completely
you
ready.
grow
And that's essentially what
is
happened
how to look
beginning
at
in the
yourself and say,
spring of
okay,
the
like
year
I did.
70. This map
People learning
illustrates
this. What the I have to do it.
What is going on.
There was
The
nothing
famine
good.
has already been a
Yeah, I
serious
love playing
problem.
basketball. I left that out. That's something I love to do. I don't care about
And
that.
Titus
That's make the
thinks that
fucking list.
he's going to have
Because
a
the list that I
fairly
had to live
easy
by was
time
the
attacking
very
Jerusalem,
list
but
that
he's
would
actually
get me
quite
at this
surprised
table with you
because the rebels
to talk to you
provide unusually stiff
the
resistance.
normal human
Even though
beings
they're
I
busy
once
fighting
was
each other, they
about
end
how
up
you
becoming
can
quite
get somewhere.
ferocious
And how it
fighters against
looks
the Romans
very
at the same
ugly.
time. A couple of key
There's no
examples
fucking
include
passion.
that the
No
Romans
fucking
settled in
motivation.
on one of
There's no,
the
oh my God,
surrounding
man, I
hills
fucking,
nearby, Mount
this is no,
Scopus and also
it's
the Mount
every
Olives,
day of
and
your life.
they
Just
get
do it.
themselves set because they're going to be building their siege
No
engines and
passion.
things like that.
No
The
discipline,
rebels
no
surprise
motivation.
them
All these
by
words I hate
pouring
people. I hate.
out of the
There's so many
city
people
of
fucking use
Jerusalem
these words because
and
it's
actually
just water.
attacking uphill
It's
at tremendous
someone sitting in the room by themselves and they figure
and
themselves
they
out.
actually
God,
managed
this
to make
fucking
tremendous
sucks.
progress. Titus
Where's
himself
passion?
is wounded in
When you're
one of
300
these
pounds.
attacks until they finally are able to push
Where's
the
the
rebels
motivation if you
back
can't read
into
and
the
write?
city. And they very
Where is
narrowly
it?
evade
So how did
destruction
this happen?
by this bold
I just
and
fucking
rather
did.
unusual attack.
I just did.
Another example,
I said maybe at
the
the end of this
Romans,
journey
you
there'll
know,
be something
their
there for
way
me. If
of
not,
destroying the city
I can
is
read.
going to be with lots of
If not,
people
I'm
and
over 85
technology,
fucking pounds.
specifically the building of siege
There's no
engines,
magic
which are
potion.
these
There's no.
massive
Oh, they
towers that they can
wake up
wheel up to the
look at some
walls,
shit.
and
No,
then they can
all those words
throw
are
things over with
overused. They're
catapults, and they
bullshit.
can climb
It's all
over
bullshit.
the walls with them. But it
Just
takes
do.
time to build these
You're
things,
living.
and there are
How do
certain
you want to
places
live?
where they are
How do you want to die?
most
How do
ideally
you want to fucking be
situated.
remembered?
So while they're busy
That's
building
it.
these things,
That's
the
it.
rebels actually
Period.
dig underneath the
As
ramps
many of you know,
that they
I've been
intend to
taking AG1
use
daily
for
since
the siege engines,
2012. So I'm
and they
delighted
build a
that they're
tunnel
sponsoring the
underneath, they
podcast.
fill it with wood,
AG1 is a
and
vitamin
when
mineral
the
probiotic
Romans
drink
place
that's
their
designed to meet all of your foundational
laborious
nutrition needs.
product of
Of
their
course, I try
work,
to get enough servings
the
of
siege
vitamins and
engine in
minerals
place,
through
the
whole food
rebels
sources
set
that include
fire
vegetables and
to
fruits
the
every
wood in
day.
the tunnels,
But oftentimes I simply can't
collapse
get
in the
enough
tunnels,
servings.
and
So
destroy
with
the siege
AG1,
engine.
I'm
It's
able
like
to get enough
hugely
vitamins and minerals
frustrating
and the
to
probiotics that I
Titus
need.
because
And it
this
also
is
contains
is
adaptogens
schlepping
to help
out, so to
buffer
speak.
stress.
The war is going
Simply
on much
put, I
longer, and
always
it's
feel better
actually
when I take
embarrassing
AG1.
to
I have more
the
focus and energy,
Romans
and I sleep
that
better.
their
And
food should be
it also
having
happens
such
to taste great.
success.
For all these
Josephus
reasons, whenever
puts
I'm
it
asked,
very
if
well
you
when
could
he
take
says
just
that
one
the
supplement, what
Romans
would it
held
be?
it to be
I answer
terribly
AG1.
disgraceful.
If you'd like to try
Cunning
AG1, go
should
to
always prevail over valor,
drinkag1.com/Huberman to claim the special
desperation
offer. They'll give
over
you
weapons,
5 free travel packs plus a
mass
year's supply of
over
vitamin D3
expertise,
K2. Again,
Judeans
that's
over Romans. In fact,
drinkag1.com/Huberman.
that's what is happening
Word
in
haunted
the early months
is
of
ringing in my
the
head.
siege,
Yep.
that they are
think
able
it's
to
such a
pull them
powerful
off
word,
with the combination of
because
cunning,
I was about to
desperation,
say,
mass,
seems
and
like a huge part of your
Judean,
process,
yes.
maybe the entire process
The
is
last
all
decision that
stick,
Titus
no
makes, therefore,
carrot.
is
You know,
to
you talk about the
say, you know
carrot,
what,
positive thing, and then there's the stick, the thing you're trying to avoid. Feel like it's the way it's landing for me is
and he builds this
it's
massive
all
siege
stick
dike
and gas pedal. There's
functionally the
no
fourth
carrot.
wall
You're not
in
imagining,
Jerusalem.
oh, when I'm a
And
paramedic, when the book is
mans
published.
it very
And obviously
carefully
you set
to
those
make
goals
sure
and you make
that
those
no
targets,
food
but it's
can be
all
smuggled
stick.
into Jerusalem from the surrounding
No carrot.
countryside.
Think about that.
He shuts down any
I
possibility
want to get
for
up right
Jerusalem
now
to get any
studying.
provisions from
I
the
have a
outside.
test
And
tomorrow.
combine that with the fact that
Already passed the fucking
the
test.
zealots have already destroyed
Think about
their
that.
own grain stores.
Every day of my
They
life.
descend into a horrible
That's what I
level of
must do
famine,
just to
which
retain
Josephus
what I learned.
describes in very pathetic terms,
4 hours plus a
involving
day.
human
I go
cannibalism
through.
and the same kind
There's
of
no
terrible
stick.
things that
Oh, there's only a
ironically
stick.
are also described in
There's
the
never
book of
been a carrot.
Jeremiah.
Which is why
Lamentations
when I speak to people,
First Temple.
I have
In the end,
to figure out a
Jerusalem is
way
doomed and
to
it will
resonate with
fall
them.
to
Because all I want to say to them
sieges.
is,
The story behind it, however,
let me
is
teach you the
somewhat
real life.
complex.
How it really is. The
Josephus
reason why you're a
says
loser,
that Titus
the
holds a
reason why
war
you're not
council
fucking making it,
and says
and
that
the reason why
he
you're
wants
trying to go through all
to
these, I go
burn
to all these
out
fucking
the
conventions, speak all the fucking
temple
time.
complex and take
I'm
care of the
looking at
last
fucking
rebels,
audience.
but he
These
wants to
people
actually
sign up,
preserve the
sign
temple
up,
itself.
sign up,
And
fucking
it's
every year,
possible
go to convention,
that Josephus
thinking they're going to learn
places
something
Titus
fucking
in
different.
a very
No,
positive
you're
light
lazy.
here,
You know exactly what
because
to do.
he is
Exactly what
Josephus'
to do. Because
quote,
even me,
sponsored by
in my
Jesus.
state of,
He, in fact,
I can't
ends
read it right.
up,
I
being
knew
assigned
exactly what
the
to do.
Flavian name because
It
of his
just
close
sucks
relationship
doing it.
to the Roman
It
Emperor
sucks
family.
to do it.
But
It sucks to wake
it's
up
also
every
possible
morning
that
of your
Jesus
life and say,
wanted to
God,
preserve
man,
the
I'm
temple because, after
not
all,
smart.
it was like one of the great
So guess
wonders
what I
of the
gotta do?
world.
I
It was one
gotta
of
study the
most
same shit that I
fascinating and
get
well-known
one of the highest
architectural
scores in the nation.
renovated significantly under Herod,
Do it again.
and
Do it again.
attracted
Do it again. It's not just there.
thousands upon thousands
It's
of
not just there
pilgrims from
permanently.
all around the Middle East,
So
Jews
yeah,
and
it's all
non-Jews
stick.
as well.
It's all
So we don't
stick.
really know how true
The
this
only
is, but
carrot
it's not
you have
impossible to imagine that
is
Jesus
like
did not actually want to
maybe,
destroy the temple itself. He wanted to
maybe,
destroy the
because whenever I
rebellion,
take these tests
but
that are real
and he may
hard,
have rededicated the temple
the
to
back of my
Jupiter or
brain is
something
like,
like that, like
good chance you're not gonna
Antiochus
make it,
did.
Goggins.
When
This
the
ain't you, bro.
Greeks conquered the region. But
This ain't you. You
this
were
is at
born
any rate
like
the account
this.
that Josephus
This
gives.
ain't you, the real
Now,
you,
the
bro.
rebels,
Study all you want
in
to,
the
but the second that
context of this
fucking
fighting, which we
computer comes
discussed
on with
in a little bit
150
more
questions,
detail in the previous lecture,
this ain't you, man.
they rush out to engage
Somehow,
the Romans,
comes
and
back
in
and
that
passed.
context, according to
Passed
Josephus,
again.
one of the
Passed
rebels
again.
grabbed a piece of burning wood and threw
That
it
ruled
through
me
a
back here every
window
fucking time.
into
Just
the
saying,
inner sanctuary, and that was actually the
that's you.
spark that ignited the
That's you.
burning of the
And I have
temple
to
itself, which
outwork
continued
that
from
voice.
the 9th
When I'm
of
taking that test and
well
I get to a
into the
question, I don't
10th
fucking know the
of
answer.
and it's
I'm
supposed
like,
to
fuck, man. And then,
for the commemoration
I told you,
on
man,
this day, the 9th of
that ain't you.
So
You're
if we
300
can
pounds, man. You
conclude,
sit at home, you figure
let's
out
just go
how
back
to do
to
your hair.
ideas should or
That's
could
what you
a
do.
minute.
How to come to
That,
school with the
we
reverse
look
ball
at the
this
very
when you're
beginning.
16.
And I remember reading,
That's
it was so
you.
fascinating to see his
So,
account of the destruction
there's
of
no get out of jail
Jerusalem,
free cards.
viewed from the lens of a Protestant
This is why I say
theologian
stay
from
home.
Germany in the 19th
Because when
century.
you are given the
He
gifts,
concluded
the
by
only
saying
thing you
this:
can do in life is stay
a
home.
Jewish authority in
And
the
I know
earlier
people
sense
cannot
no longer
stand.
existed.
They can't
With the
stand
destruction
this
of the temple,
talk.
the ending of the sacrifice
This is
that actually occurred
all
a few
you
weeks
can
earlier
do.
on the 17th of
There's no
Tammuz.
magic pill or a magic
What the
potion.
Jews how
All
they
you
were
can
to
do
relate to
is
God
outwork
in a
the
physical
man
way
that God
no longer
created, or
existed.
woman,
Authority
in you.
itself
And what
had
that looks
disappeared.
like is
The only center
unfun. That's why I
left to
said
the
do
people
not do a
was the
documentary
Torah.
on me.
They
Because
now
people
rallied
will
around
not
it,
see the truth.
anxious and
They will see what they want to see. Is I don't live
the
like
unwavering hope that it might
Good.
once again, in a
Good.
political
You will live exactly
and
the way
indeed
you
in
live
the
now,
world itself,
questioning who
acquire
you are,
practical
wondering
ability.
what is possible, wondering what you are capable of doing. That's how that looks. Or you can be me, which,
Hopefully,
am I happy?
this will be the last
I don't
night of
know.
love
Never
that
thought
we
about
have to
it. Never really
commemorate
cared.
together.
Because all I really
Next
cared
time,
about was I looked
will
in
be a
that fucking mirror. I
celebration
saw a
and a
piece of shit.
rebuilt Jerusalem.
Happiness wasn't
Thank you
on the
very
mirror
much
at
for your
16.
attention.
Or when I was doing Japan, I was looking,
For
I'm
those of you
looking
who
for
are fasting,
happiness.
you can conclude
No,
the
I'm
fast
looking
well.
to look at myself in the mirror and say, all right, motherfucker, you did again today. You're a bad boy. Because that shit sucks. I had about a couple of minutes of that. And I got the carrot. And the second I lay down to go to bed, the carrot's gone because I'm waking up all through the night to check the work I did that day. Did I get this drug right? Did I get this right? Did I get that right? What did I do? Oh my God, fuck.
Hello, everyone. I hope you are well. Today is Rosh Chodesh Elul, the first day of the Hebrew month of Elul. It traditionally occurs in the late summer or early fall, and it is an incredibly important month in the Jewish calendar for reasons that I'll explain shortly. I'd like to take a moment as a kind of a departure from our traditional Jewish history lab format of going through more conventional social, political, and economic history and look at literary history. People have sometimes criticized the nature of Jewish history as being a combination of books and pogroms. That may have some value to it, but for today we're going to focus on books. We're going to look at these really amazing trend in literature, which has become known the Musar tradition. So let's just take a step back, though, and talk about what exactly is Elul. So according to Jewish thought, the high holidays, which begin with Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year, this year it falls in early September, is a period of judgment for all humanity. And this awesome day, and it's not just that day, it extends to Yom Kippur, and according to some of the more mystical treatments, much later than that as well. But, we have to prepare ourselves for that judgment, in which, the assessment of the prior year is made and a decision is made about what's going to happen in the future with an individual and a community and a nation and so on. So the month of Elul is this penultimate month in the Hebrew calendar, and it is set aside as a month of self-reflection, of self-analysis, of determination of, how well one has done over the year, how close they are to the person they want to be. And it's an opportunity for us to look at our lives and look at how we treat the people around ourselves and try to make amends. Apologies is a very big part of Elul. This is considered the best time to kind of, clear the accounts we have with other people, not only in terms of paying our financial debts, but also in terms of paying our emotional debts. And trying to wrap things up so we go into Rosh Hashanah with a clear as conscience and a record as possible. So in this context, it has become a tradition for many centuries now that Jews read literature related to repentance during the month of Elul. And I'd like to give you, over the next few minutes, some of my favorite Elul reading texts, some of which I've loved so much that I ended up publishing something on them myself. But I hope that you will find this as meaningful and, in a kind of cathartic way, as enjoyable as I do. It is really a good feeling to be able to reach deep and to think hard about how one behaves and then make some resolutions about how one will try to improve for the future. This sort of coalesced historically in something called the Musar movement. So the word Musar is kind of an unusual term. It literally means to hand over, kind of like in a relay race, one hands over the baton. And so sometimes it's translated as tradition in the sense of the Mesorah, the tradition, refers to the teachings that Jews have received from Mount Sinai over the generations. In the 19th century, it acquired a particular connotation, specifically relating to this body of ethical development. That there's a whole series of readings and exercises and kind of like a sub-discipline really focusing on how to improve one's character. It was pioneered in the 19th century by people like the Alter of Slobodka, Rabbi Rothschild, a phenomenal individual. I wish we had a really good photograph of him. I bet it would just glow off your screen. And so there, we speak about Musar literature, even though the movement itself is really only a few hundred years old. The whole idea of it goes much further back than that. Also, I should put in this context that colloquially, to give someone Musar means something else entirely. To give someone Musar means to rebuke them, to berate them. Now that's kind of like a negative sense of the word Musar. That's not the sense in which I'm taking it here. The Musar is really quite a cleansing, beautiful thing when studied properly. Incidentally, it is best to study Musar alone or with a small group of trusted individuals, people who you can sort of, reveal your thoughts to and get honest, constructive feedback. So there aren't too many people like that in most people's circle of friends, but that's really the best way to learn Musar. We're going to be looking at the Musar canon, right? Like the series of works that are the go-to texts adopted by the Muslim. I'm not at all going to be exhaustive. There are so many fantastic books, some of which are really classics, but I'm not going to talk about them very much because they haven't really resonated with me. I'm going to be more of a personal approach. For example, there's a very important medieval work called Shari Tshuva, the Gates of Repentance, which is good. I enjoyed it, and it was a classic, and many people derive tremendous benefit from it. But I find that the whole discussion of levels of regret, he identifies 20 different levels of regret. That just puts me off, and I just can't stay with it very long. I'm going to look at books that I found very meaningful, and hopefully that will make an impact on you. The first book that I'll look at very quickly is something called Pirkei Avot, or the Chapters of the Fathers. This is not, strictly speaking, a narrow work in the Musar tradition, but it is central to the canon. It is an ancient book. It's a collection of statements of the rabbis from about the year 200 before the Common Era to about the year 200 of the Common Era. So about, close to 400 years of rabbinic wisdom, all boiled down to these little pithy comments, which are absolutely stellar. This and all the books I'm going to describe for you have been life-changing books for me. And Pirkei Avot comes in so many different translations, I couldn't decide which one to provide for you, but I will give you this website, safaria.org. If you're not familiar with it, definitely check it out, because it has an incredible wealth of Judaic texts, often in translation, and Pirkei Avot appears there, of course. It also appears in your prayer book, if you own one, that is in this particular section. There's 6 very short chapters. It comes to about maybe 25, 30 pages in English text without commentary. It's usually found in the section for Saturday afternoon. By the way, I should mention, these videos, I know they reach a very, very broad audience, so I'm trying to speak to people who have never heard of Pirkei Avot before, to people who have virtually memorized it, and I apologize if I'm being a little too redundant for those of you who are advanced, and for those of you who are new to the Musar tradition. Well, welcome, and I hope you enjoy these texts. One other text that I will not speak about too much, but I should mention at least here, is the famous Chovot HaLevavot, or Duties of the Heart, which was written around the year 1080 by Rabbi Bachya Ibn Pakuda, a very important Iberian thinker who produced a work in Judeo-Arabic that is widely studied. To my mind, even though it is generally considered the beginning of the Musar tradition, even though Pirkei Avot is 1,000 years earlier, that's more of a philosophical work. Although it has tremendous amount of ethical implications. I think the same thing in many ways applies to Ibn Pakuda's work, and it doesn't resonate with me as much as some of the later works. So let's go to the ones that I find really fantastic. So I've divided these books into 4 categories, and I know if you're familiar with some of the things I've published, I've sometimes divided Musar literature into different categories, but for this video, I've got the how-to books of Musar, like how does one actually improve? What are the steps that are required to do this? And then what I'd like to call the psycho-emotional, in which we already know what we have to do, but please help us find some motivation to get there. Please convince us that we really should be sacrificing for the higher ethical good. And then there is the Kabbalistic literature, which also, all these categories borrow from each other, but the Kabbalistic literature leans very heavily on some of the mystical teachings of Judaism in quite a fascinating way. And then finally, the last category that I'd like to go over with you is what I've called postmodern Musar. A difficult term in some ways, but let's get to it now. Let's start with the how-to parts, the how to repent. So here's one of the books that's made such an impression on me that I wrote a commentary on it. And this is a shameless book plug because I feel really excited about this particular work, but I want to talk to you about it anyways. So Maimonides, who wrote this massive work called the Mishnah Torah, and if you poke around on my website, you'll find all kinds of videos in which I've discussed this at greater length. But basically, he was the first one in the entire Judaic tradition to kind of encapsulate in one work exactly how does one do tshuva, for repentance. How does one engage in repentance? The term repentance is not a really close translation for tshuva. Tshuva actually means more like return or respond, in the sense of coming home or come back to center. But that's the best word we have, I think, in English. So this particular book, his laws of tshuva, actually explain in a step-by-step manner. First you've got to identify the problem. Then you have to feel regret for the problem. Then remember, there's 20 levels from the Shari Tshuva. He doesn't go into 20 levels. And then you've got to confess it. Then you've got to make amends and apologize and things like that. And then he has a long discussion about related philosophical concepts, like, well, what's the point? What does it matter? Well, there's reward and punishment in Judaism, life after death, issues like that. And he goes into discussions of free will versus determinism. Absolutely amazing. And so in my personal contribution, it's a very small one, but I find it personally meaningful. I have written a translation of this particular section of the Mishnah Torah, and I have, and there's also good translations available in Safari and elsewhere, and I've written a commentary as well. And what I find really exciting about this is that I evaluate the commentary every year as part of my personal tshuva process, and also because I dedicated a book to my late father. So the cover you're looking at right now is from the 9th edition, which includes 2 years of reflections that I've had reading Maimonides in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic that we are hopefully going to be past very soon. So this is a great how-to. If you want to start with what do I need to do to improve myself, this is a great place to start. Another great place to start, which is not really a Musar book as well, it doesn't fit precisely into the categories, but it's a work by this individual, the Chafetz Chaim. Now that's actually not his real name, it was Yisrael Meir Cohen, but he wrote his first book anonymously under the title One Who Desires Life, Chafetz Chaim. Here's a cover of it actually, and it's based on a verse that says, who is the one who desires life? It's in the book of Psalms, chapter 34, that the answer to that question is one who guards his tongue from speaking evil, right? Meaning no gossip. And this is like a mind-blowing book that totally changed my life. It's basically a book on the laws of proper communication. And so much of our challenges in life are associated with how we communicate with others. So this particular book is definitely an incredibly important contribution to the Musar canon because it really breaks down not why you should speak properly. It does have a section at the beginning about that, but it lays out in Judaism what does it mean to speak properly. And it is just a bare track of an argument that he presents. It is inevitable and it is overwhelming, and it will really change the way you speak. It's very hard to keep every single detail of the laws in this particular book. The founder of the Muslim movement, Yisrael Salanter, once said that it is sufficient for one to simply read this book and sigh an expression of, oh, I wish I could live up to this level of personal integrity, but it is fantastic. I will give away just a little bit of it. One of the huge, perhaps the greatest contribution of this book is pointing out that, according to Jewish thought, it is forbidden to relate any negative information about anyone. Full stop. Like, what? That just eliminates every conversation I've ever had, or maybe like 90% of every conversation I've ever had. So there are 7 preconditions that if one meets all 7 of these preconditions, one may in fact relate negative information. But otherwise, no, you can't speak ill about anyone anytime. It's a really great book. Highly recommended. If you are not familiar with rabbinic thought, it's hard to read it in translation because it will introduce you to so many other ideas, and it requires a pretty strong foundation to understand it properly. This is also because he wrote it not for regular people, but really for other rabbis. He wrote, you can tell from the initial chapters, that it's really intended to convince the rabbinic elite that, hey, we're not speaking properly. We have to do a better job. Look at all these things. So it's a high-level work, and I would recommend if you would like to access this wisdom, I would start with something like this. This is sort of like an anthologized version of it, which is kind of like watered down for people who are not necessarily so overwhelmingly familiar with the rabbinic thought. And it's also laid out in a very manageable size so that you can study it over a period of time. There are like days and with a shoulder note, so you can say, okay, day 1, day 2, day 3, and so on. And I read this English translation, or really an adaptation, and I profited from it tremendously, as well, of course, reviewing the Hebrew several times. It actually informs not only my personal speech as best I can manage it, but also my writing as a historian is really affected by the Chafetz Chaim. So those are 2 really good how-to texts. The first one on repentance in general, and another one on such an important element, which is specifically the laws of proper speech. And I really encourage you, if you are so motivated, have a look at one of these books during the month of Elul. Now, if we move to the psycho-emotional, I'd like to show you two books. One that I really enjoy is Orchos Tzadikim, and this is a medieval work which is written in the 14th or 15th century in Germany. It was really originally written in Yiddish, not in Hebrew, and it was written anonymously, just like the Chavetz Chaim, by the way. He wrote his first book anonymously, using that title, Chavetz Chaim, by which he has become known. If I remember correctly, the reason why he eventually revealed that he was the author is because there were some people who were impersonating him. You know, imagine walking into a shop saying, "I'm the Chavetz Chaim, pay me for a speaking engagement," or whatever. And so he has to put a stop to that. But Orchos Tzadikim was written anonymously. It's not impossible. It would be unlikely, but not impossible that it was actually written by a woman, because it has all kinds of cooking metaphors and kitchen metaphors and things that would be related to a woman's life, which is quite fascinating, kind of domestic issues. But it was definitely written by a very, very learned person, also relying quite heavily on Maimonides. And this is an edition that has a commentary by Rabbi Avram Yachnis, a wonderful commentary that I've profited from as well. I've read it in his translation with his commentary as well. Now, what this particular book does is it goes through a series of gates, most of which are kind of emotional in nature, like the gate of anger, the gate of happiness, the gate of silence, and in each of these gates, it defines the topic, like let's say trust, bitachon. It defines what is trust in God, and then it talks about how to develop trust in God, and it talks about the ways in which trust in God is beneficial. Maybe I'm talking about a sequence a little. And then it talks also about ways in which trust in God may be detrimental, amazingly enough. And so I always found this especially good to learn with adolescents or people in emerging adulthood, like me, because, it really sort of gives you an adult, mature perspective on personality development. And it's a wonderful read. It's got excellent sourcing in traditional texts, and it's a very creative way of looking at all human characteristics in a very comprehensive manner. A second book, which I'd like to put in the same category, so the Orchos Tzadikim was written around the 14th, 15th century. This book, the Mesilat Yesharim, or the Paths of the Just, the Paths of the Straight, literally by the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Nitzato, a genius of the 18th century. This is a book that I personally have ambitions to complete, as apparently the Vilna Gaon did, 101 times. So I'm up to about 27 now, with lots of breaks in between to kind of let the information sink in. And I've been giving a class in this for a couple of years as well, and there's some videos on my channel as well. Now, this is probably the king of all Musar texts. It has received an unusual level of popularity and acceptance across a breadth of the Jewish intellectual spectrum. Not only do the so-called yeshivish or the misnagdim, Lithuanian elites, accept this as a tremendous work of ethical thought. The Hasidim love it because he was a tremendous Kabbalist and had tremendous influence on Hasidic thought as well. Even the masculine, the Enlightenment thinkers from Moshe Mendelssohn on praise it, because he also wrote some secular materials, or at least more secular materials, like he wrote plays, for example, in Hebrew, and poetry and things like that, which were not so common in 18th century Italy. There's a tremendous backstory to his life, in that he was a child prodigy who was then mercilessly attacked and pursued bitterly with false accusations that he was a follower of Shabtai Tzvi, the disgraced false messiah, and so on. And this is the book of his maturity. He wrote in his late 30s. He actually died a very young man after he had moved to Israel. But this is an absolutely fantastic book. Now, I specifically recommend this edition, the complete Mesilat Yesharim, because for hundreds of years now, since it was published in the 1730s, we've been studying one particular version of Mesilat Yesharim, which is kind of like a straightforward text of ethics. In 1991, a new version was discovered, an autograph version written in his own hand in an archive in Leningrad. And this new version is called Seder Vikuach, or a dialogue version. It's written as a kind of a play, as a kind of a dialogue between two figures, much like Platonic dialogues and things like that, between a so-called Chacham and a so-called Chassid. And it's hard to really parse exactly who these figures are, but the Chacham is kind of like a well, first of all, the two of them were friends in their childhood, and then they separated sometime in their early adolescence, and they meet up with one another. You get the impression that they're probably around 25 years old or so when you meet them, when they meet each other again. And they've changed quite a bit since they were children. The Chacham has kind of become a well-rounded individual with higher education and appreciation of secular culture and curiosity about science and things like that. And on the other hand, the Chassid has become very, very pious. Dresses in black, spends a lot of time meditating, studying Psalms, and the Chassid is such an item of curiosity to the Chacham. That is the kind of well-rounded person who's so curious. He says, what does my friend do all day? How can he spend so many hours invested in prayer? And so he goes up to him, and he's so happy to see him, and they start talking about their different approaches to life. And the Chassid ends up dominating the conversation. Pretty early on, the well-rounded person realizes that his well-roundedness is kind of like a lot of breath, but he has sacrificed so much depth for it. And he is just entranced by what the Chassid has to say about the internal spiritual world that he inhabits. It is so dramatic and so fantastic. I actually prefer the dialogue version because it has that tremendous level of additional excitement attached to it. But at any rate, what an amazing book. What does he especially say to the Chacham? He essentially says that there's a series of levels of personal development you have to go through based on the teaching in the Talmud. You have to go first from watchfulness, which is kind of like protecting yourself from harm, to alacrity, which means like to seize opportunities, to move forward when you see an opening. And he goes through all these levels that discuss how we can, improve ourselves on a step-by-step basis. It's a little more complicated than that. One of the biggest challenges to understanding this is that sometimes Mesilat Yesharim seems very much like a ladder, that you can't get up to the higher levels until you have finished the lower levels. And in other places, it seems more like a garden, that you engage in some weeding and beautification over here in this area, and then you go to another area and you start putting some fertilizer down. Then you realize that you need to go back and do some more weeding in the first area. Both of these things coexist in Mesilat Yesharim. Please poke around my website. You'll find some videos where I talk about it in a little more detail. But anyway, I find this particular book just so amazing, and I strongly recommend it. So that's kind of the psycho-emotional type of Musar that reaches in and kind of like forces you to think about it in a different way and react to it in a different way. Let's go to the Kabbalistic school right now. So this really originates in the phenomenal explosion of thought that occurred in Sfat, in northern Israel, in the 16th century, largely fueled by refugees from the Spanish and Portuguese expulsions. There are a number of thinkers in this town, which was just a phenomenon how many of them were concentrated in this little place for such a brief period of time for the middle of the 16th century, but they wrote some amazing things. In particular, you have this book, which I always found so meaningful, The Palm Tree of Devorah. And the basic idea of this is that, we have this concept in Judaism of imitating God. There's actually a Latin term for it in Christianity, I understand, called imitatio Dei, the imitation of God. And in Hebrew, it's different terms. There's an idea in today of cleaving to God. The Talmud asks, how can one cleave to God? God is, by metaphor, an all-consuming fire. How are you supposed to, cleave to fire? And it says, well, what you have to do is essentially you have to do what God does. Now, in order to do what God does, it's important, essentially argues Rabbi Cordovero, that you have to understand who God is. You need a little bit of a biography of God. And in that regard, he turns to the Sfirot, which are these, essentially this, how can I describe it? A way of understanding God's interaction with the universe through a series of emanations. I don't want to go into more detail because it's really confusing. But, they correspond to words like kindness and severity and glory and beauty, grace, foundation. We don't know exactly what these terms mean. I certainly don't, but Kabbalists do. Anyway, what Rabbi Cordovero does, he tries to give us a little bit of a sense of how is God expressed in terms of, for example, Tiferet, glory. What does that look like? So he describes what is Tiferet. What do we mean by that? And then once we know who God is, then we understand a little bit more about how we should behave. And that's exactly what the Tomer Devorah does. The Palm Tree of Devorah describes, look, this is who God is. This is what God does as a result of who God is. And then we can do these things in imitation of that. Just as God clothes the naked, so we too can clothe the naked. So as God feeds the poor, so we can also feed the poor, and so on. It's absolutely fascinating. The best part of it, without doubt, and I get excited thinking about it right now, is the first chapter, which is just overwhelming. There's a sphera called Keter, or crown, which refers, argues Rabbi Cordovero, to God's 13 levels of forgiveness. That God is able, in 13 very different ways, 13 different strategies, to forgive humanity on a daily basis. And as he goes through each of these 13 levels, he describes how, look, God forgives us in this way. We should also forgive others in this same way. It is an amazing book, so much so that I wrote a translation and commentary of that first chapter, which is huge. It's like 1/3 of the entire Palm Tree of Devorah, and I've titled it The Kabbalah of Forgiveness, because one of the biggest things about repentance and the month of Elul is being able to forgive those who have transgressed against us. To cite the Lord's Prayer that I said every day when I went to public school. That, we have to let go of the anger we feel at others who have legitimately wronged us. I mean, in the sense is that we have a legitimate argument with them, but it's very difficult to progress until we can let go of that anger. And so by reading the Tomer Devorah, one can get 13 strategies for forgiving people. I myself have a favorite, level 6. That's almost always the one I use when I do forgive people. And some people make me so angry that I have to go all the way to level 13, which is like the nuclear strength way to forgive people. Then I get angry at them again later, and so I have to, try again and again and again. It doesn't like this forever. But nevertheless, this is really a transformational book. I encourage you to poke around my website. I actually have a series of lectures on each of those levels on my channel that you might find valuable. Ooh, the Kabbalah of Forgiveness. Wow. Now, finally, let's go to the last stage, which I have called postmodern. And the truth is, the 3 books that I'll introduce to you are not really directly addressing Musar in a postmodern sense throughout the entirety of their books, but they begin to touch on it. And we're still waiting for a really great postmodern reading of Musar. But anyway, let me introduce you to them. Here's one that I find just fantastic. I read it a couple of years ago. David Bashevkin's Synagogue, Sin and Failure in Jewish Thought. There are very few works that deal with failure in a comprehensive analytical manner, and this is one of them. And it's really, I got so much out of reading this book. Now, Rabbi Rothschild is an incredibly funny individual. I count him among my personal friends. If you check on Twitter, you cannot type in Jewish without finding David Bashevkin somewhere in there. He is the king of Twitter, and he is incredibly funny. But don't mistake his humor for a lack of depth. He's written another Hebrew book called Beroge Zrachim Tizkor, I think so, which is a really, really profound book, also in synagogue. And synagogue, I think, will give you hope for those failures in your own life that will really make a difference for you and help you move forward. It certainly helped me move forward. Another book that really looks at postmodernism straight on is this collection of essays by the great Rav Shagar. Faith Shattering the Story is the title of the overall collection. Now, Rav Shagar, who passed away a number of years ago, was one of the few thinkers who really understood the nature of postmodernism and struggled to articulate a Jewish response that could incorporate the challenge that postmodernism places on the system of thought that Judaism represents. It is. You feel it's a work in progress. You feel that there are, attempts to deal with it, but kind of like this evocative photograph shows, it is a sincere grappling with some of the challenges of the age we live in, and I really felt like I gained quite a bit from this book. And then finally, this amazing book, which does address postmodernism head on in several chapters. It's a remarkable book written for a general audience. Morality, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times by the late Jonathan Sachs. It just appeared this year, and it is very, very worthwhile reading by a broad swath of readers who are interested in ethics in general. Wow, okay. I gave you a very quick overview of some of my favorite Musar books. I hope that you will find some of them useful as well, and I wish you a tremendous amount of success in your personal development. The next video is going to be going back to regular history, in other words, more pogroms, less books, but thank you very much for your attention.
It's just a vicious cycle, and if you're not strong mentally, and you have no willpower, you're going to continue falling back in this hole versus the man that sits back and goes, all right, motherfucker, this is why I cuss. This is what is in me. This is what it took for me to be me. Sorry. It didn't take, hey, okay, we're going to do this today. No, this fucking really sucks.
Rabbi Posey challenged me to speak specifically on something related to this particular season in Jewish thought, which is, of course, the month of Elul, the penultimate month of the year, at least if you go according to the calendar of Tshuva, of repentance. We use this month to prepare ourselves for the awesome, high holy days, or the days of awe, as in the sense of really being awesome. And, it occurred to me that this is actually a very traditional, hugely traditional way to look at Jewish history, not in terms of like a linear progress from the past to the present and onward into the future, but rather kind of like a gyre that history spins out like kind of one of those, conical springs that, if you remember the poem, it speaks about the ever-widening gyre that spins around the same circumference every time. And we always come back to Elul. The reality is that the very, very first book of history in Jewish rabbinic culture, setting aside the Tanakh, which the Hebrew scriptures are definitely tremendously valuable as historical sources, but not necessarily written to provide historical data rather than religious data. One of the earliest source ever is a text called Megillat Ta'anit, the Scroll of Fasts. It's a small document that was written in the late Maccabean age, the period of the Hashmonaim, that is about the first century before the Common Era, and essentially it's a list of days in which it's forbidden to fast because good things happen to the Jews. It's a very small book, right? Like, not that many good things happen, so therefore there are only so many days that you have to fast in, or not fasting. That's essentially what this text is. And it is really the first book of rabbinic thought that was ever actually set to text. And the funny thing about it, connecting to my opening comment, is that it is not organized in a chronological fashion with the past at the beginning, the early past at the beginning, and then moving through until the time of the author. It is rather arranged according to the months. So when you get to the month of Nisan, it describes all the important historical things that happened in every month of Nisan, and you get to the month of Teves, all the important historical things that happened in the month of Teves. And it is an incredibly difficult book to read because then you have to, if you want to think chronologically, you have to like rearrange them to fit a pattern that's much more linear. So it's very hard to speak about Elul as a historical phenomenon by like picking apart months of Elul throughout Jewish history. That was the challenging part to it. So, but what inspired me was perhaps we should really focus in on what Jews are doing in the month of Elul, which is of course getting ready for the high holidays and taking that self-assessment and the self-examination that is essential to the Teshuvah process. And when I thought of it in that way, this lecture came together, I think, in a very interesting fashion. So first of all, what is Elul? As I mentioned, of course, as you're all aware, Elul is the beginning of the season of repentance. Of course, repentance is something that you can do any time during the year, but this is the Eit Ratzon. This is the time that is especially well organized, well laid out, and it's something that we do individually because repentance is, after all, very much a private affair. But knowing that everyone is doing it at the same time reinforces our resolve to complete this often very difficult process. The Hasidim, particularly the Alter Rebbe that influenced Chabad Hasidus, has a very wonderful way of expressing this. They like to say, the king is in the field. Meaning, normally, if you want to make an appointment with the king, if you want to, petition the king and apologize for the arrears and taxes or wherever it is that you didn't do right over the year, you've got to make appointments and you've got to wait and there's bureaucracy and there's uncertainty. But in the month of Elul, says the Alter Rebbe, the king, as it were, comes out into the fields to greet the common person working in agriculture. It's probably derived from this verse here, let the field exult and all that is therein, then shall all the trees of the forest sing for joy before Hashem, who has arrived. Meaning this is the time of year, Elul, when the king will leave the palace, as it were, and come more than halfway to meet us. We don't even have to expend any effort in order to engage ourselves in the Teshuvah process. That's really what the month of Elul means. We hear the shofar blown every morning in synagogue to remind us of the upcoming blast of the Lamb's horn on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and it's supposed to, alert us to the fact that we have to take care of this. Life lived in a stagnant mode is entirely unsatisfying. We are creatures of change and development, and we need this time in order to develop ourselves into the people that we really want to be for ourselves and for our children. So, in this context, what I would like to do is to develop a particular thesis that I think you may find appealing. I myself I'm enjoying it quite a bit. I tried to think of like, well, who are the great writers who have addressed Elul in very significant ways, and what do they have in common? What brings them together into this Elul movement? And as I chose some of my favorites, and I have to let you know up front that we're going to be studying 3 Moseses. Obviously we could have picked hundreds of literary figures who engaged with Elul in this matter, but I tried to choose 3 that are highly representative of unique and lasting movements. They're all named Moses, ironically, but I found one common thread that went through all of them, and I think many of you may find it as meaningful as I do. They are all children of survivors. It's very unusual in that when you look at the lives of these 3 Moseses, their parents went through incredible trauma, and they are the next generation to look back at the experience of their parents and how their parents were scarred by that. And these 3 Moseses try to respond with literary efforts that have an incredible impact on Jewish thought. Specifically, we're going to look at the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, known also as Maimonides, who wrote in the 12th century. We'll look at a somewhat lesser-known figure, but well-beloved to Kabbalists, the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who lived in Sfat in Israel in the 16th century. And then finally, we'll look at the incredible Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, an Italian Jewish thinker who has had incredible reception among Jews around the world since he began his magnum opus, the Mesilat Yesharim. And I want to take a few moments at the end to contemplate what this means perhaps for our generation, because of course we are also a generation that inherits the experiences of the Holocaust. And, either directly or communally, we are all the children or grandchildren of survivors. What does that mean for our generation? I could not think of any specific Moshe who reached that level, but I do have one suggestion that perhaps you will find useful. So that's the goal. Over the course of the next 40 minutes or so, I'd like to introduce you to these 3 thinkers. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with them already, but I'm going to focus in on their contributions to the thought related to Elul specifically, illustrate how their thought evolved from the trauma that their parents experienced, and show how in their own unique ways each of them contributed to creating a phenomenal ladder for tshuva that all of us can climb to this day. That is the goal. Okay, so with your permission, let's go first to and I have to say one last sort of like warning. I care deeply about all of these figures. I spent a lot of time, years in fact, studying all 3 of them, and on 2 of them I wrote and published books. So it's hard not to talk about people that I'm very, very enthusiastic about without at least mentioning my own contributions, small contributions to the scholarship on their topics, but that caveat emptor. All right, here we go. So Moses Maimonides. So this is the great ego, of course, one of the most towering figures of Jewish intellectual history, who strides across the continent of Europe and North Africa with tremendous confidence, because he's a figure who had so much impact over the last millennium. There, as the statement goes, from Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses, because he really was incredibly unique. This is the statue of him that is erected in his home region of Cordoba in Spain. It's rather ironic because he was, of course, expelled from Spain as a young boy, and his family had to flee the dramatic change in fortune that Jewish families endured with the advent of the Almohads, a rather radical Muslim group that were shifting the priorities of tolerance that Jews had enjoyed in Spain up until that time. You'll recall that Maimonides he was born right near the end of the famous golden age of Sephardic